It all began in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, located in the heart of America. This place is considered ideal for young people who aspire to start a family and raise children. It would seem that for Joshua and Amber, a young couple expecting their first child, Tulsa should have been a cozy nest where they could build their happy future. However, as often happens in life, reality turned out to be quite different. Amber, an 18-year-old high school graduate, was an excellent student and actively engaged in sports. She was a member of the Future Farmers of America Club, which demonstrated her determination and ambition. Amber had lived with her mother and stepfather in Tulsa since she was 5 years old. Joshua, a 22-year-old native of Tulsa, was also an outstanding athlete. Following in the footsteps of his father, a career officer, he decided to pursue a career in the U.S. Armed Forces. His brother Zach, also a military man, was undergoing training before being deployed to Afghanistan. From the outside, Amber and Joshua seemed like the perfect couple, an attractive girl and a handsome, charming pilot. It appeared that they had a bright and happy future ahead of them. Both had loving families and strong ties in the community. However, as a detective with many years of experience, I can say that appearances are often deceiving. Behind the perfect facade, serious problems and conflicts can lurk, which only intensify over time. Even I, a seasoned detective, was struck by what I heard next. For those who observed their relationship from the outside, everything seemed like a fairy tale. A young couple in love who, without wasting time, decided to get married. Just a few days before Joshua finished military technical school, on September 7, 2010, the couple tied the knot and threw a lavish celebration. However, reality turned out to be not so cloudless. Joshua received an assignment to serve in faraway Alaska, thousands of miles away from family and friends. Amber, as a devoted wife, followed her beloved without hesitation to a small town with a harsh climate and an unfamiliar way of life. She took on the task of setting up a new home and establishing a household, trying to create a cozy atmosphere for herself and her husband. But was this the only reason for the changes in Amber's behavior? Joshua's brother Zach began to notice that the girl seemed to be trying to escape from something, immersing herself in household chores. He also had a feeling that Amber, from the very beginning of their acquaintance, controlled Joshua and manipulated him. Zach even advised his brother to stay away from the girl. However, upon learning about Amber's problems in her family and her mother's poor treatment of her, Zach suggested that the girl had developed a difficult character. Perhaps that was why she was somewhat nervous and demanding. He hoped that the courtship, marriage, and relocation would benefit Amber and help her build a relationship with Joshua. But did these hopes come true? Unfortunately, neither the move to Alaska nor the wedding could fix the situation. On the contrary, it only worsened. From my experience as a detective, I can say that serious problems often lurk behind the perfect image. Excessive control by one of the partners, manipulation, attempts to escape from reality. All these are alarming signs that point to possible future conflicts. Unfortunately, those in love often ignore these signs, hoping that everything will work out on its own. But was there something in the case of Joshua and Amber that could have prevented the tragedy? Were there moments in their relationship when something could still be changed? Joshua, while on duty, often called his brother Zach and told him about Amber's strange behavior. At first, it was obsessive calls and complaints about loneliness, which Joshua regarded as a form of psychological and emotional pressure from her side. But the problems did not end there. Soon, Joshua confessed to his family that Amber had begun to show physical aggression. She beat him and threw various objects at him. Zach, trying to help his brother, advised him to contact the military police on the base and officially document these incidents. He understood that the situation was getting out of control and required intervention. One time, Joshua told Zach about a particularly horrific incident. Amber, in a fit of aggression, hit him with a lamp and pushed him down the stairs. He also mentioned that during their stay in Alaska, his wife developed a drug problem, which only worsened the already tense situation in the family. As a detective, I can say that substance abuse often becomes a catalyst for domestic violence. People lose control of themselves and resort to aggression, destroying not only their own lives, but also the lives of their loved ones. Eventually, the command of the unit where Joshua served sent the couple for counseling, trying to save their marriage. But it seemed to be too late. Less than 9 months passed, and the situation reached a critical point. Joshua was expelled from the military academy, and the couple was forced to return home. At that point, Amber was already pregnant. It would seem that this news should have brought the couple together, become an incentive for them to start from scratch. But unfortunately, this did not happen. Amber's mother settled them in an apartment on the 25th floor of a multi-story building, which became a witness to constant quarrels and mutual accusations. Unfortunately, as often happens, people hope until the very end that everything will work out on its own, without realizing the full seriousness of the situation. What I am about to tell you now will make you look at everything you have heard before in a different way. The fateful day had come when Joshua and Amber's relationship reached the point of no return. Despite the fact that Amber was in her 7th month of pregnancy, it seemed that this only added fuel to the fire of their constant conflicts. That day, another quarrel broke out between the couple, which quickly escalated into a fight. In the heat of emotions, they knocked over the television and broke the bedroom window. This was not just a conflict, but a real brawl that threatened not only their mental health, but also their physical safety. Interestingly, just 2 days before this, Joshua had filed a request for a protective order, trying to protect himself from his wife's aggression. But unfortunately, this document remained unnoticed, lost among other papers. The broken window could not go unnoticed. The owners of the building, upon learning about the incident, contacted the couple and informed them that they had to compensate for the damages. Armand Rosales and his team were called in for repairs. When the craftsman voiced the amount of $150, it only added fuel to the fire. Another argument broke out between Joshua and Amber. Joshua insisted that he could fix everything himself, trying to save money. But in the end, perhaps tired of constant quarrels, the couple still gave their consent to the repairs. During this time, Amber, consumed by anger, entered and exited the room several times. Her behavior clearly indicated an unstable emotional state and uncontrolled aggression. Meanwhile, Joshua's packed suitcases were already standing by the door. He had gathered his belongings, documents, even CDS, preparing to leave his wife. The day before, Joshua had called his father and arranged for help with the move. But due to his father's delay at work, the young man was forced to turn to friends for help. And now, my friends, a very important point. Creating this kind of content requires a considerable amount of time, and currently, my channel and I are experiencing financial difficulties. I would be immensely grateful if you could become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to your comments and even mention your noble name in my video. So please consider becoming a sponsor. I will be endlessly thankful for your support. This scene vividly illustrates how tense and unhealthy the relationship of this couple was. Even pregnancy did not become a restraining factor or motivation for them to find common ground. Aggression, mutual offenses, and the desire to run away from problems instead of solving them, that's what characterized their marriage at that moment. In my opinion, there is a line when a conflict turns into something more than just a quarrel. And in this case, Joshua and Amber had long crossed that red line. If you thought that this story could no longer surprise you in any way, get ready to change your mind. While the couple continued to argue, Mr. Rosales, who was repairing the window, sent his assistant to the truck parked below for additional materials. Perhaps he just wanted to get away from this tense atmosphere and disputes for a while. Stepping out of the room into the corridor, Rosales began talking to a neighbor when suddenly he heard screams coming from the apartment. No, no, no. This was followed by the sound of rapid footsteps, a loud crash, and more screams. This cacophony of sounds did not bode well and indicated that the conflict between Joshua and Amber had gotten out of control. At the same moment, Rosales' assistant, who was already heading to the truck, heard the sound of breaking glass. Later in court, he would give stunning testimony. It was like in a movie. I saw this guy falling and heard him screaming and so all the way down. Only a few seconds after that, Amber's face appeared in the broken window. This moment became a key point in the whole story. On the other side of the street, Robert Baker, who had just come out for a smoke, looked up at the sound of breaking glass and saw Joshua falling. Without wasting a second, he immediately called the rescue service, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Later in court, he would confirm that he saw the guy flying out of the window face forward. Meanwhile, Mr. Rosales returns to the apartment and comes upon a shocking scene, a broken window. Approaching closer, he looks outside, trying to understand what happened. Suddenly, Amber comes out of the room and starts screaming that her husband fell out of the window, that she pushed him. This confession stuns Rosales, and he instinctively feels fear to approach Amber, fearing that in a state of passion she might push him too. As a detective, I can say that such situations, unfortunately, are not uncommon. Domestic violence often leads to tragic consequences, especially when emotions take over reason. Amber's sincere confession immediately after the incident indicates that she may not have fully realized what she had done in a fit of anger. You will be stunned when you find out what happened next. I want to draw your attention to Amber's behavior immediately after the tragedy. Being in a state of shock, she tried to convince Mr. Rosales to go down with her to her fallen husband. Rosales agreed that perhaps instinctively sensing danger, he led Amber to the lobby, not to the parking lot as she had asked. He even called the building manager to accompany the woman, while he himself stepped away to call the police and keep a safe distance from Amber. Rescuers, firefighters, and police quickly arrived at the scene. What they saw shocked even seasoned professionals. Amber was found next to her husband's mutilated body. She held his head, kissed him, and desperately begged everyone around for help. Later in court, firefighters would testify that Amber was screaming hysterically, begging them to save her husband at all costs, otherwise she would go to jail. One of them also noted that the woman was in such an unstable emotional state that they were even afraid that she might throw herself off the parking lot on the 8th floor. Unfortunately, it was too late for Joshua. The injuries sustained from the fall were incompatible with life. He died on the spot from a severe impact. While specialists worked at the scene of the tragedy, Amber called her grandmother and asked her to come to be with her. The police officer who was to accompany Amber to the downtown police station allowed her to wait for her grandmother. He led the woman to a part of the lobby, away from the gathering crowd of onlookers. Then the same officer drove Amber and her grandmother to the station in a patrol car. And it was during this trip that something very important happened. The police officer accidentally overheard Amber quietly confessing to her grandmother that it was she who had pushed Joshua, and because of that he fell out of the window. This confession would become a key piece of evidence in the subsequent investigation. I have encountered similar situations many times. Often, people who have committed a crime in a fit of passion then sincerely repent. They seem to not fully realize the reality of what happened and feel the need to speak out, even if it will harm them later on. At this stage, there were many questions swirling in my head. What exactly happened in that apartment? Did Amber really intentionally push Joshua? What was the relationship between the couple that led to such a tragic end? Prepare yourself for the fact that your emotions will be off the scale, because what happened next defies comprehension. As soon as Amber and her grandmother arrived at the police station, they were immediately taken to a special interrogation room. This room was equipped with everything necessary: recording devices, surveillance cameras, as well as basic items such as water and medicine. The police made sure to create the necessary conditions for conducting the interrogation and gathering information. Leaving the women alone, the officer entered the adjacent observation room. He understood that something important for the further investigation could be said now, so without wasting time, he turned on the recording. What happened next is difficult to describe in words. Amber seemed to have lost touch with reality. She began to talk to her grandmother, but her words resembled more of a delirium. "I shouldn't be here. Josh is dead, and I'm here," she repeated over and over again. Amber was aware of the full tragedy of the situation, realizing that with her actions she had ruined not only her own life. "I didn't just lose my husband. Jean and Patrick lost their son, Zach lost his brother and his grandmother. Grandma has a bad heart, and she won't survive the news of her beloved grandson's death." These words are permeated with pain, fear, and despair. Amber seemed to be reliving everything again, recalling the smallest details. "I still don't remember holding his mutilated body and just looking at him." Such memories are capable of breaking even the strongest person, and Amber was already in an extremely unstable emotional state. Amber's grandmother, a wise woman with a wealth of life experience, understood that her granddaughter needed support and consolation now more than ever. She realized that if Amber continued to blame herself, it could lead to irreparable consequences. Therefore, the grandmother began to calm the girl down, saying that Joshua was now in God's hands. She tried to give Amber at least some foothold, something to hold on to in this terrible situation. In the conversation, Amber began to recall the time spent with her husband in Alaska. And here something very important was said. It turns out that when the couple was prescribed counseling sessions, one of the counselors let slip that if Amber and Joshua stayed living together, she would eventually kill him. This information sheds new light on the whole story. Were the counselor's words just an unfortunate statement, or was there something more behind them? As a detective, I understand that every detail, even the smallest one, can be crucial. Therefore, this mention of the counselor's words will definitely be taken into account during the investigation. We need to understand whether it was just a coincidence or whether someone might have foreseen the tragic end of this story long before its climax. During the conversation with her grandmother, Amber suddenly uttered a phrase that clarifies a lot in this complicated story. She said that if she had known what it would lead to, she certainly would not have pushed Joshua. These words sounded like a kind of confession, albeit an indirect one. Amber's grandmother, upon hearing this, immediately asked, "But you didn't push him on purpose, did you?" And right away, as if trying to fix the situation, she advised her granddaughter to say that it all happened accidentally. This moment is very important because it shows that even Amber's closest people understood how serious the consequences of her words could be. Further events unfolded around the confrontation between two families, Joshua's relatives and Amber's. Each side tried to defend their truth to protect their child. Joshua's family claimed that he had tried in every way to help Amber, to give her the opportunity to start a new life away from the toxic influence of her own parents. They believed that Joshua wanted his wife to overcome a harmful addiction, give birth to a healthy child, and enjoy motherhood. However, according to them, despite all her husband's efforts, Amber continued to use prohibited substances even during pregnancy, and also abused Joshua, knowing that he loved her too much to fight back. On the other hand, Amber's family blamed everything on Joshua. They claimed that he himself was cruel and allegedly had also been taking some substances lately, which is why he fell out of the window. This version was radically different from the one voiced by the relatives of the deceased. As you can see, dear viewers, the situation was extremely complicated. Two families, two truths, and each side defended their child to the last. In such cases, it is always difficult to figure out where the truth is and where there is an attempt to justify a loved one. The local police had to unravel this tangle of family contradictions, and although both versions deserved attention, the law enforcement officers had more trust in the testimony of Joshua's relatives. After all, Amber herself admitted that she had a hand in her husband's death. That is why she was officially charged with murder. But even at this stage, many questions remained. Was it a planned, cold-blooded murder? Or was that counselor right who warned that if Amber and Joshua stayed together, he would kill him sooner or later? At that time, there was no direct evidence of intentional murder. If you thought that this story could no longer surprise you in any way, get ready to change your mind. Considering all the evidence and eyewitness testimony, the investigation concluded that it was a second-degree murder, a crime committed in a state of strong emotional distress. Witnesses who were present in the apartment and those who saw Joshua fall out of the window told about the fierce quarrels of the couple that lasted throughout the day and eventually led to the tragedy. Everything indicated that a conflict had occurred between Amber and Joshua, which got out of control and had fatal consequences. From a legal point of view, Amber's actions were qualified as something between involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide. Her behavior during the interrogation and her own words indicated that she did not plan to kill her husband, but at the same time, her actions led to his death. Initially, Amber was released on bail as the defense began to build a line of defense and gather arguments in her favor. During this period, the woman gave birth to a boy, but unfortunately, motherhood did not keep her from further problems with the law. The conditions of Amber's stay at large before the trial were quite strict. She had to observe a curfew, constantly be under the supervision of her mother or grandmother. In addition, the woman was obliged to wear an electronic bracelet to track her movements. Amber also had to regularly submit urine tests and undergo examinations using a catheter to confirm that she was not using prohibited substances. However, as surveillance records show, Amber repeatedly violated the conditions of her release on bail. She missed the curfew or allowed her monitoring device to turn off at least 10 times. Surveillance agents also noted that Amber often asked to change her overnight location at the last minute. But the most alarming signal was that in 2 cases, traces of prohibited drugs were found in Amber's urine. There were also cases when her tests were so diluted that they could not be checked for the content of narcotic substances. All this indicated that Amber continued to lead a lifestyle that ultimately led to the tragedy. Eventually, due to regular violations of the conditions of detention, Amber was sent to the local prison pending trial. And here, even more shocking details became known. Other prisoners reported that when Amber was approached about her husband's death, she laughed and openly stated that it was she who killed the scumbag by throwing him out of the window. Of course, such testimonies required careful verification. After all, it is quite possible that these women, with whom Amber shared prison life, could distort her words or add something of their own. But in any case, this information could not be ignored by the investigation. The investigation of this case was a real challenge for everyone involved. It was necessary to gather together all the details, separate facts from rumors and emotions, and based on this, compile a clear picture of what happened. Ahead of us was a trial that was to put the final point in this tragic story. So, dear viewers, we have come to the end of this tragic story. But before putting a period on it, I want to draw your attention to some details that shed light on what happened to Amber after her arrest. Having found herself behind bars, it would seem that Amber should have reconsidered her actions and felt guilt for what she had done. However, as her cellmates testify, she continued to behave defiantly and even laughed when mentioning her husband's death. Moreover, Amber openly stated that it was she who killed Joshua by throwing him out of the window. But as soon as the woman found herself in the courtroom, her behavior changed dramatically. A completely different Amber appeared before the jury, quiet, frightened, claiming that she acted exclusively in self-defense. According to her version, Joshua attacked her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and she, defending herself, simply pushed him away. Allegedly, this is what led to the guy tripping over candlesticks and falling out of the window. However, the evidence gathered during the investigation cast doubt on the truthfulness of this testimony. A forensic medical examination showed that Joshua had suffered numerous injuries incompatible with life. He had broken legs, arms, ribs, sternum, and pelvis. In addition, serious damage to internal organs was found. At the same time, a toxicological analysis did not reveal any traces of alcohol or drugs in Joshua's body. Detectives also paid attention to the state of the crime scene. In the photographs, it is clearly visible that the massive candlesticks near the window stood motionless. There were no signs of a struggle or disorder in the room. This cast doubt on Amber's version that Joshua accidentally fell out of the window after tripping. And the window itself was unlikely to break so easily after all. The building was erected back in 1966, and the glass in it was not tempered as in modern high-rises. Amber's defense twice tried to make a deal with the prosecution, offering her to plead guilty in exchange for a mitigated sentence. But the woman stubbornly refused to compromise, insisting on her version of events. In the end, this played against her. The jury only needed 3 hours to find her guilty of second-degree murder. Amber was sentenced to 25 years in prison and a hefty fine. In addition, the court ordered her to pay for her husband's funeral expenses. The woman filed an appeal, claiming that her lawyer did not defend her interests well enough, but the higher court left the verdict unchanged. It would seem that the story should have ended there. But already in prison, Amber suddenly expressed a desire to talk to journalists. She gave an interview to the BBC, appeared on The Doctor, Phil Show, and later gave written consent for an interview with a local TV studio. However, this meeting never took place because the next day after Amber sent the letter, she was found dead in her cell. As the examination showed, the woman committed suicide by hanging herself with an electrical cord. Relatives and friends refused to believe that Amber could have committed suicide. As proof, they cited the same letter in which she agreed to an interview. However, during the autopsy, traces of self-harm were found on the woman's body, cuts on her wrists and forearms, and toxicology showed the presence of drug and antidepressant residues in her blood, so the version of suicide, unfortunately, looked quite probable. This tragic story left no one indifferent, neither Joshua and Amber's relatives, who still mourn their children, nor the little boy who was left without parents due to the cruelty of adults, nor all of us who witnessed these terrible events. On that July morning in 2019, the residents of Utica, New York, were getting ready for the traditional Boilermaker race. It seemed like nothing was out of the ordinary, but around 7 a.m., a disturbing call came into 911. The dispatcher immediately sent patrol cars to Post Street, where some crime had allegedly taken place. This street is a typical dead end, stretching from west to east off Culver Avenue and ending in a wooded park area. The officer who arrived at the scene saw a black SUV parked there, and next to it a man lying on the ground in a pool of blood. Right before the cops' eyes, this guy suddenly tried to cut his own throat, while simultaneously attempting to take a gruesome selfie. The policeman also noticed a body covered with a tarp next to the Jeep. Judging by the outline, it was a woman. The young man was frantically shouting that he had killed his girlfriend and was going to follow her. The responding officers managed to stop the suicide attempt and call for medics. The injured man was taken to St. Elizabeth's Hospital with serious neck wounds. The surgeons did their job, stitched up the wounds, and stabilized his condition. It was obvious that this guy had just committed a horrific murder and was possibly in some inadequate state of mind. Initially, law enforcement did not disclose the identities of the people involved in this gruesome event. However, information about what had happened began spreading on the internet very quickly. As it turned out, a young man named Brandon Clark managed to post a series of shocking photos on his Instagram account shortly after the incident. These images showed a prone vehicle and a dead girl who was nearly decapitated. In one frame, her face and upper body could be seen. In another, Clark's bloody hand with the words, "Sorry, Bianca." Then his account was deleted. But Brandon didn't stop with just Instagram. On his profiles on other social networks, he continued to publish disturbing content. For example, there was a photo where his bloody hand reached out to a body covered with a tarp with that same inscription, "Sorry, Bianca." Also, a selfie with a neck wound and the caption, "Goodbye." Moreover, after posting his last Instagram story, Clark added the date of his own death, July 14, 2019. Eventually, the administration of the internet platform stopped the spread of these horrible images. But while the official authorities remained silent, internet users had already managed to identify the deceased girl. She turned out to be Bianca Devans, who had several social media accounts. Based on rumors and speculation, people began to construct the most incredible theories about the events. Local online communities were literally boiling with discussions. Emotions were polarized from sincere sympathy to cynical mockery. Groups even appeared that lured people in with promises of shocking content allegedly. Those very scary photos that Clark had published in messengers were available there. I will not retell all the speculation and conjecture that swirled around this case. Let's move straight to the facts and examine the key figures in this tragedy. I'll tell you everything now, but only to those wonderful people who have just subscribed to the channel, liked this video, and left any comment below so that this video is seen by as many people as possible. Because this story is a prime example of how social media can instantly spread information about a crime, even when official sources are still silent, and how difficult it can be to separate truth from fiction and rumors in this flood of information. The victim of this horrific crime was 17-year-old Bianca Devans. She had just graduated from high school and applied to a local college, intending to study psychology. And by all indications, this choice was not accidental. The girl's life was not cloudless. Back in 2010, problems began in her family between her parents. Constant loud quarrels, and Bianca's mother even filed domestic violence reports several times, but then withdrew them. For the girl, who was the youngest child in the family, all of this became a serious emotional upheaval. At school, Bianca was diagnosed with a whole host of mental disorders: depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2015, her father finally left the family, which did not improve the girl's condition at all, because she loved her dad very much and had a warm relationship with him. This event only deepened her psychological problems. Her mother took Bianca to several specialists, but there was no noticeable progress. It got to the point where the girl began having panic attacks right at school, and even had to be briefly admitted to a specialized clinic. After that, Bianca switched to homeschooling, and here the amazing world of the internet opened up before her in all its glory. On Instagram, she had only about 2,000 followers. However, in the specific community of the 4chan image board, the girl gained much more popularity. This site, as you may know, is a gathering place for very peculiar people with specific slang and subculture. They say there aren't that many girls there, and those that are usually fit certain stereotypes: white, big-eyed anime fans. However, let's not dwell on the peculiarities of 4chan now. Rumor had it that Bianca even sold some of her revealing photos to her fans there, and some even showed screenshots of correspondence supposedly confirming this. But there is no certainty about this. Nevertheless, classmates generally characterize Bianca as a pleasant, albeit somewhat quirky girl. Unfortunately, sad statistics indicate that very often problematic behavior and mental disorders in adolescence are rooted in family troubles and traumas. Although I admit, I'm hearing about the subculture of this 4chan for the first time. I'll have to ask our experts about this. Bianca's ex-boyfriend said that at first their relationship was wonderful, but later the girl began to show jealousy and hysterics for any reason. Although in my opinion, these changes in her behavior could well coincide with the exacerbation of her mental disorders. Some of Bianca's acquaintances noted that she was too straightforward in communication, especially with guys. Later, another interesting character appeared in the girl's life, an online friend who began to persistently court her and even stalk her in real life. This story lasted about 2 years and nearly drove Bianca to suicide. At least that's what she told her doctor, who sent her for treatment at a specialized inpatient facility. However, on the eve of the tragedy, the girl's life seemed to have settled down. The violent mood swings were behind her. She looked to the future with optimism and even joked, recalling the last few years of her life. As for Brandon Andrew Clark, his biography was also not easy. The guy grew up in an unstable family where his father created an extremely tense atmosphere. When Brandon was about 12 years old, his father held him and his mother hostage for several hours, threatening them with a knife. Then the police settled the situation, and the boy was placed in the care of a foster family. At the time of the tragic events, Clark had just turned 21. He lived in the town of Bridgeport, not far from Utica, where Bianca lived less than an hour's drive. The young people met on Instagram a few months before the incident, first just communicating and then meeting in person. Bianca even met Brandon's family, and he made an impression on them as a polite and caring guy. His friends also generally described Clark as a good person who was into fitness and anime. But there was one alarming fact: Brandon turned out to be a liar. It's not surprising that in Bianca's case, these problems coincided with the exacerbation of her condition. But the story with the online stalker is already an alarming bell. Unfortunately, virtual stalkers are a real scourge of our time, and I'm afraid to even imagine what the girl had to go through during these 2 years. Yes, let's take a little detour and figure out what this lolaball is. The internet explains this term as a combination of the words Lolita and complex. In Japan, it refers to sexual attraction to prepubescent or early pubescent girls, or those who look like them externally. In essence, it's a type of pervert with children. I won't go into details. If you're interested, Google it yourself. And here we come to a delicate moment in Clark's biography. It turns out that when he was 16, he corresponded online with a 12-year-old girl. Brandon's friends who knew about this tried to stop him, but he brushed them off, saying he would deal with it himself. So certain alarm bells were already ringing even then. Let's return to Brandon's relationship with Bianca. That summer, they had already become quite close and spent a lot of time together. On Saturday, July 13, 2019, the couple planned to attend a Nicole Dollanganger concert in New York. They arrived at the venue around 7:30 p.m. Before the event, they smoked marijuana with an acquaintance in his car and went to the concert. And there, a sudden quarrel broke out between them. And the reason is that Brandon saw Bianca meet and joyfully greet some Alex, her old acquaintance. As it later turned out, he was one of her numerous online friends. The girl instantly switched all her attention to this Alex, ignoring Clark. And a little later, Brandon saw the two of them kissing. After the concert, the enraged Clark drove Bianca back to Utica. The whole way, he tried to sort things out, but the girl just fell asleep in the car. Then the guy, already in the city, stopping on the dead-end Post Street, continued to express his indignation at her frivolous behavior. Why didn't anyone turn to the school psychologist or social services? His friends tried to stop him, but is that enough? As for Brandon's jealousy at the concert, of course, seeing your girlfriend flirting or kissing someone else is unpleasant for anyone. But his reaction still seems somewhat excessive, unhealthy. According to Clark's testimony, during that fateful conversation on Post Street, Bianca stated that everything was over between them, that she was no longer interested in him, and that she had never promised him mutual love. These words seemed to finally destroy Brandon's already fragile psyche. He grabbed a large knife with a black handle and inflicted fatal wounds on the girl. He filmed this entire horrific process on his phone. Leaving Bianca's body in the car, Clark got out, gathered some branches and started a fire. And then he got busy actively posting on social media. He logged into the girl's Instagram account and published a photo of her mutilated body there. Of course, shocked subscribers quickly noticed the picture, but at first they took it for some kind of sick joke. However, when Brandon uploaded a few more fresh photos of the murdered girl to Discord, it became clear that this was not a prank. Someone did notify the police, but there was too little information for immediate action. Meanwhile, Clark sent messages to his relatives, briefly saying goodbye. It looked like suicide notes. Then he threw his laptop into the fire. He called Bianca's family home and coldly reported that he had killed their daughter. And around 7:21 a.m., he himself contacted the 911 dispatcher and said, "I killed my girlfriend," giving his location. While the police were rushing to the scene, Brandon managed to scrawl something like, "You will never forget me," on the ground with a stick, lay down next to the body under the tarp, prepared a knife and phone, and waited. You already know what happened next. The very next day, Brandon was charged with intentional murder. Cops carefully studied his online activity and found out that he was literally obsessed with Bianca Devans. He constantly Googled her name, monitored social networks, saved her photos, bombarded her with messages. Clark even tattooed an image of a girl on a swing on his leg, Bianca's personal symbol. There was also a theory that he might have drugged her and used her sexually, but this assumption remained unconfirmed. Unfortunately, the finale of this meeting turned out to be tragic. Of course, hearing such things from a girl was painful, but can it be an excuse for murder? And such a brutal one, with filming the whole process. This is clearly something much deeper than just jealousy or anger over rejection. There are already signs of a truly unhealthy obsession, persecution mania, and control. And these creepy posts on social media, as if he was bragging about what he had done. But this assumption remained unconfirmed. Meanwhile, social networks were exploding with heated discussions. Most users were shocked by this horrific story. But oddly enough, on the infamous 4chan image board, there were those who praised Clark and mocked the tragedy. The gruesome photos posted by Brandon on Facebook and Instagram quickly spread across the internet. The scale of distribution was such that the administration of the resources was forced to add these images to digital fingerprints and block publications based on them. For a while, even Discord servers had to be shut down. But despite all the efforts of the moderators, these materials can still be found on 4chan upon request. The cynicism and surrealism of the situation are striking. Having just committed a brutal murder, Clark does not flee or hide, but begins to flaunt his crime on social media. He posts gruesome photos, sends farewell messages to relatives, throws evidence butts into the fire, as if playing some kind of perverted game, and at the same time he presents himself as almost a romantic hero, carving a message for the victim on the ground. The reaction of some users on image boards who literally mock the memory of the deceased girl is also disturbing. As for Brandon's obsession indeed, his behavior has all the signs of morbid stalking and obsessive mania. Constantly tracking the victim online, collecting her photos, tattooing her personal symbols, although the version with so far remains unproven. However, all this is yet to be thoroughly investigated. There's a lot of work ahead: examinations, analysis of digital evidence, psychiatric evaluations. We will return to this high-profile case in our chronicles more than once. In the meantime, I would like to once again express my sincere condolences to the family and friends of Bianca Devans, and to warn all our viewers, especially young girls, be extremely careful in virtual acquaintances. Do not ignore alarming signals. Do not be afraid to ask for help. Such obsession and inadequate behavior are a reason to sound the alarm. Unfortunately, this story is another proof that in our age of digital technology, danger can lurk where you don't expect it. During interrogations, Brandon Clark repeatedly claimed that he did not remember the details of the crime, referring to some kind of mental breakdown. But when investigators found the horrific murder video filmed by the suspect himself on his smartphone, his memory miraculously cleared up. Although he still did not admit guilt. It would seem that in December 2019, the guy should have been thinking about how to save his skin. But no, he managed to get into new trouble. Already in the one other county jail, a shiv made from a toothbrush was found in Clark's cell. Now the charges were compounded by the distribution of prison contraband. Probably realizing that things were bad on February 10, 2020, Brandon did change his testimony to guilty. The court scheduled the sentencing for April 7th. But as you might guess, the pandemic and quarantine restrictions got in the way. And what do you think? By the beginning of summer, Clark changed his mind again. On June 2nd, he sent a petition to withdraw his guilty plea. He said that his lawyer had forced him to make a deal with the investigation. But the judge, remembering that at the first hearings the defendant had no complaints about his lawyer, rejected this ploy. Another attempt to hold a hearing took place on September 30, but the written decision was ready only by October 30, and again the announcement of the verdict was postponed, this time to December 8. However, there were already rumors that Clark was facing at least 25 years or even life. In the end, that's what happened. On March 16, 2021, Brandon Andrew Clark was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At that last hearing, he finally officially repented for what he had done. However, the psychologist involved in the case regarded the defendant's actions as a classic case of domestic violence, provoked in their opinion by toxic masculinity and the desire to assert his power over the victim. And the head of the local Department of Criminology, Alison Margarski, added that Clark's behavior fully corresponds to the typical profile of a violent male criminal, who feels wronged and deprived and therefore tries to assert himself through violence. You know, in my career, I've already seen so many suspects who forgot everything and then suddenly remembered everything. You see, video evidence of their crimes is a kind of 21st century know-how. There was no such thing before. But I admit, even I was struck by the fact that Clark managed to cause trouble with a shiv while already in jail. This clearly indicates his personality. I hope that during these long years behind bars, Brandon Clark will rethink his life and actions. Although who knows? Time will tell. However, I promise we will return to the analysis of this chilling and instructive case in our next issues more than once. After all, such stories make us wonder how to protect young people from terrible mistakes, how to notice the alarming signals, how to prevent new tragedies. We must seek these answers. I consider it my social mission to tell you about such cases. This is not just true crime. This is in fact my social responsibility. If you have listened to this point, I am very grateful to you, and I am sure that now you will be more careful with your children. But this is not the end yet. Section 9. It turns out that this horrific story did not end there. In July 2021, more than a year after the tragedy, Bianca's family filed a lawsuit against the Waneta County Prosecutor's Office. What is the essence of their claim? According to the plaintiffs, the district attorney himself or one of his subordinates deliberately leaked video recordings from the killer's phone to the internet. And most disgustingly, it was an intimate video featuring Clark and the underage Bianca. These scandalous footage somehow made it to the air of several local TV channels. They also made it to the national show 48 Hours on CBS. Moreover, one YouTube blogger also got hold of this video. From a legal point of view, the lawsuit qualifies the actions of the prosecutor's office as the illegal distribution of a child's intimate video, which is terrible. It's hard to say how this litigation will end. One thing is clear, the prosecutor's office will not give up easily. We will have to wait for official comments. But the very fact of such a leak, and even more so from the materials of a criminal case, is a terrible blow to the already traumatized family. Detective Brooks. Over the long years of service in the police, I've seen all sorts of things. But this case just knocks me off track. The brutal murder of a young girl, the broadcast of all this on social networks, a criminal obsessed with obsession. And now there's also a leak of such sensitive content. Did someone in the prosecutor's office want hype or sensation? You know, video recordings from the phones of the persons involved are a very specific type of evidence. On the one hand, they can shed light on the details of the crime, add strokes to the psychological portrait of the suspect. But on the other hand, it is always very personal, intimate information, and the leak of such data can cause irreparable damage to the reputation and dignity of both the victims and their loved ones. I'll be frank, if these accusations are confirmed, it will be a real shock for me personally, because it undermines trust in the system as a whole. I want to believe that the investigation will put everything in its place. But even now, before its completion, I sympathize with Bianca's family. To survive such grief, such a loss, and to find yourself at the center of a new scandal, I can't imagine where they find the strength. Therefore, I once again urge everyone who is listening to or watching us now, be careful. Remember that even your smartphone can hide a terrible weapon. Share personal information very selectively. And for our part, we will do everything to ensure that such tragedies do not happen again, and so that criminals are punished and the rights of victims and their loved ones are securely protected both online and offline. A young Italian woman, Veronica Panarello, faced numerous challenges in her life. At the age of 16, she met Lacy Stival at a bar, who immediately caught her eye, and she quickly opened up to him. Despite the 4-year age difference, the couple conversed as if they had known each other for a long time. Despite the girl's youth, they started a relationship. Within 3 months, Veronica was already begging to start a family. The girl had no doubts. She wanted a child from David. He agreed and they moved in together. Soon, Veronica became pregnant. In 2006, when she was only 17 and he was 21, their son Loris was born. It was then that Veronica's family began to experience problems. Constant conflicts with her parents and the desire to run away from home, intensified with the birth of the out-of-wedlock child. However, the young girl created a semblance of a family, contrary to the expectations of her elders. To the surprise of their relatives, the young couple's affairs were going quite well. Terrible trials lay ahead. But for now, Veronica tried to give her son everything he needed. Over time, the couple officially legalized their marriage. The young mother became pregnant again and gave birth to a second boy, whom they named Diego. Veronica essentially remained under the care of her parents. Although Davide worked, his efforts were not enough to provide for his wife and 2 children. The parents from both sides supported the couple in every possible way, primarily financially. Veronica, on the other hand, did not even think about looking for a job, having completely devoted herself to the children and the household. Her husband considered her an exemplary, industrious, neat, and loving wife. The children grew up, having genuinely warm relationships with their mother. She spent all her free time with them, although sometimes it resembled more of a friendship between peers. Probably because of the too early age of motherhood, there is an opinion that Veronica was still in a rebellious mood, which is why conflicts with her parents escalated. The elders believed that she would not become a full-fledged mother if she perceived everything as a game. But any attempts to get through to her ended in hysterics.
The couple lived in a rural area with a population of 10,000 inhabitants, the town of Santa Croce Camarina in southern Italian Sicily, where everyone knew each other. For such a cozy corner,
Such early motherhood seemed strange. However, no one suspected that this reckless youthful haste would lead to the terrible tragedy that we will tell you about. On November 29, 2014, at noon, Veronica Panarello appeared at the police station. The 25-year-old woman reported the disappearance of her 8-year-old son Loris. According to her, in the morning, as always, she had brought the boy to school. He went inside with the other students. Then she took her younger son to kindergarten. Loris was supposed to be at school until 12:30. When the woman came to pick him up, her son was nowhere to be found. The mother became alarmed and could not find him. Immediately after that, Veronica decided to go to the police and write a statement about the disappearance of the 8-year-old boy. Law enforcement officers immediately contacted the school, but no teacher or employee had seen Loris that day. The students also confirmed that they had not met him either near the school or in class. Some thought that the boy was skipping classes. Others assumed that he could have been kidnapped. However, no one believed that Loris would voluntarily get into an unfamiliar car. He was too smart for that. So the question arose, how could he have ended up on the street if his mother had taken him to the school door and saw him go inside? At that time, her 29-year-old husband, Loris Stival, was working as a driver and was on a trip in Rome. The Carabinieri immediately called him, and the man was shocked by the news. It turned out that his wife had not even informed him. Then he called Veronica himself, and she confirmed Loris's disappearance. David immediately got on a plane to get to the city as quickly as possible. As soon as he landed, he saw a post on his wife's social media with a photo of her and their son. It was an announcement that the boy had been found dead. Loris's body was found 4 hours after the police report. It had been thrown into a ditch near an old mill. The place was just minutes away from the couple's house by car. It was accidentally discovered by an elderly man who was hunting in the area. During his usual walk through the forest, he noticed something suspicious in the mud. As he approached, the witness realized that it was not just a discarded object, but the body of a child. The man immediately informed the police about the discovery. At the scene, criminologists found the child's mutilated body, unnaturally twisted in the ditch, with his pants pulled down and no underwear. Law enforcement officers immediately suspected a sexual motive for the crime. Investigators believed that they were dealing with a child molester. However, unlike typical perverts, he not only raped his victims, but also killed them. This made the criminal twice as dangerous. News of the tragedy quickly spread through the town, sowing panic among the inhabitants. The realization that every child could become a target of a predator instilled fear and forced people to change their usual way of life. The news of the murder in the small village instantly flew around all of Italy. The country's central TV channels talked about the victim. This event became one of the loudest newsworthy events of 2014, stirring up the public. Society demanded that the police catch the criminal as soon as possible and bring him to justice. Meanwhile, detectives, working tirelessly, searched for the monster capable of such an act to calm the community. The investigators working on the case immediately noticed some strange details. The crime was clearly not committed according to the classic scheme characteristic of typical rapists and maniacs. The strangest thing was not even the absence of the child's underwear. After removing it, the criminal put the pants back on the body. Such abusers do indeed often collect the victim's belongings, but they almost never put the clothes back on after taking the trophy. Moreover, no similar cases had been observed in this area before. The police turned their attention to the family of the deceased. Veronica and Davide were decent people. Everyone knew them as a loving young family. Despite the fact that the child was born when the mother was a minor, now she had become an adult woman and really gave the impression of a devoted mother. In any case, under such circumstances, the most valuable information can be provided by the family itself. So the investigators came to talk to the parents of the murdered boy.
Here, the police found out that Davide spent very little time at home. Due to his work as a driver, he was with his family for no more than 50 days a month. Almost all the free time, the children were with their mother. Thus, the young woman was constantly left alone, without a husband. It was not easy for her to cope with household chores and raising children on her own. The woman often complained about the difficulties. Against the background of her loneliness, rumors about lovers spread through the town. However, during the check, it was not possible to confirm this information. At the Stival family's house, the police found Veronica. According to Davide, this tragedy had destroyed her. The young mother was constantly crying and refusing to eat. Subsequently, this led to exhaustion. The young woman was taken to the hospital, where she had to be given special IV drips with a nutritious solution so that she would not die. The police saw her during this period. She really looked bad. Veronica was emotionally broken. It even manifested physically. Huge dark circles formed under her eyes and her skin took on an unhealthy pallor. During this period, Loris's younger brother Diego was still living with the family. However, later, the parents took him to his grandparents, as the mother was in an unstable mental state. She did not take care not only of herself, but also ignored the needs of the child. The husband supported his wife all this time and was forced to quit his job. Despite the difficulty with which the Stival family was experiencing the loss of a child, the investigators decided to bring both parents to the place where Loris's body was found. The police made video recordings. They believed that this trip could provide useful data. In the video, you can see not even Veronica, but literally the shadow of a person. So hard was she experiencing the loss of her son. Horatio Fedone got on the list of suspects. He was the same elderly hunter who discovered the child's body. The detectives suspected him because the man had led them to the victim, just 4 hours after the boy was declared missing. Of course, it could have been a coincidence, but it was worth making sure how the man managed to find the deceased so quickly. The investigators launched a large-scale check but could not find a connection between the hunter and the evidence. He successfully passed a polygraph test, had a confirmed alibi for the morning of Loris's disappearance, and his fingerprints and DNA were not found on the boy's body. However, the heightened interest in Horatio Fedone led to local residents starting to accuse Veronica of having an intimate relationship with his grandson and even with him. In the end, after rather harsh checks, all suspicions were removed from Horatio. The detectives were convinced that Horatio had indeed accidentally stumbled upon the boy. He had the misfortune to be in that place just a few hours after Loris was declared missing. At the same time, the investigation ran out of assumptions and leads. No traces indicating the perpetrator could be found, so it was decided to call in reinforcements of Carabinieri from Rome to join the investigation. The new participants in the case, having studied all the materials, believed that the mother was involved in the disappearance of her son. They immediately drew attention to the problems in the relationship between Veronica and her relatives. The grandparents told the investigators that the deceased boy had told them about a strange experiment at school. According to the child, his mother had bought plastic zip ties needed for classes. The boy talked about this literally the day before his disappearance. This seemed suspicious because zip ties are quite a dangerous object and are prohibited from being used in school. When the detectives asked the teachers about this experiment, it turned out that they really had not planned anything like that and would not have needed any cable ties. Eventually, the investigators decided that the child had made them up. But after receiving the report from the forensic experts, the investigators remembered these items. According to the specialists who performed the autopsy, the time of the child's death fell between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning on the day he disappeared. The cause of the boy's death was strangulation by some foreign object of small thickness, tightened around his neck. It looks very much like he was strangled with cable ties. Then the investigators suggested that there might be a connection between these two facts. The forensic expert believed that the murder was committed somewhere near the place where the body was found, since the injuries from the fall were received almost immediately after death, or he was thrown out while still alive and died a little later. The detectives assumed that the child could really
for some reason, have wanted to get these ties and made up a story about their need at school. Then Loris would have had to carry them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about this? It raised great doubts that the killer attacked the boy, grabbed his backpack, and began to look for a murder weapon there. The Carabinieri considered it necessary to find the blue backpack, believing that it would give new clues. To do this, they blocked all the landfills where waste was brought from Santa Croce Camarina. In the end, it took the police several days to examine the dumps, but they never managed to find the boy's blue backpack. In addition to information about strangulation, the forensic medical examination made it possible to find out another strange circumstance. Despite the absence of underwear and the lowered pants, no signs of sexual violence or traces of the DNA of the probable pervert were found. From that moment on, the police had doubts about the previous version of events. They were still looking for the criminal, but already understood that this was not a typical maniac or molester. It no longer seemed that the crime was committed on sexual grounds. It was necessary to compile a full psychological profile of the killer. However, at this stage of the investigation, the information turned out to be too confusing, and it was problematic to do this. The solution suggested itself. The detectives decided to trace the path that the mother and child were moving on the day of the massacre. Despite the fact that it was a very small provincial town, Veronica and Loris were moving along the central street, where many houses had surveillance cameras installed. Of course, it took a lot of time to collect and view the recordings. It is clear that law enforcement officers tried to notice a third person following a woman with her son in a black Volkswagen Polo. Perhaps a suspicious car was following them. However, no matter how hard the investigators tried, they could not notice anything unusual that would be of interest to them. However, quite quickly, the detectives drew attention to several strange things. Firstly, they never managed to see the moment when the boy enters the school, although the mother continued to insist that she allegedly took him almost to the threshold of the educational institution. It became clear that Veronica was lying, and they did not reach the school that morning. After viewing dozens of hours of recordings, the investigators saw that only the younger child got out of the car near the kindergarten. The detectives continued to analyze the camera recordings from the entire district in search of clues. So they saw how at one of the intersections that Veronica was supposed to pass, she turned towards the church, not far from which the victim was later found. This seemed strange because for many years before that, she had used a different road. What could have forced the young mother to change her preferences on the very day when her son was found dead? This aroused certain suspicions among the Carabinieri. At this stage, the police officers decided not to disclose the discovered information so as not to startle Veronica, but began to consider the young woman as a suspect. Experienced policemen decided to immediately check the veracity of her words. To do this, Veronica was asked to drive with the investigators along the same route that she used on the day of the child's death so that she could show everything personally. They already knew the route as they had managed to completely restore it with the help of recordings from video surveillance cameras. The woman agreed, and they began to conduct a reconstruction of events. When the police car, together with Veronica, drove up to that decisive intersection where she changed her preferences, the woman lied. The detectives investigating the murder of 8-year-old Loris Stival began to suspect his mother, Veronica Panarello, after discovering that she had lied about her route on the morning her son disappeared. During the investigative experiment, the woman indicated that she was moving along the usual path, although the surveillance camera recordings showed otherwise. The police decided to search the Stival family's house and interrogate Veronica at the station. The young mother was outraged to learn that she was considered a likely killer of her own child. She insisted on her innocence, stating that under no circumstances would she have harmed her son. However, the investigators had reason to think otherwise. During the hours-long interrogation, Veronica admitted that she had dropped off her elder son Loris half a kilometer from the school that morning because she was in a hurry. According to her, someone could have attacked the boy on the way. The woman also denied being near the ravines where her son's body was found,
assuring that she was not at all familiar with that area. However, the suspect's sister refuted these statements, saying that in childhood they often visited there and knew those places well. Veronica's presence in the crime area was also confirmed by surveillance camera recordings. David Stival, the father of the deceased boy, at first could not believe in his wife's involvement in the murder of their son. After viewing the video recordings, he recognized Veronica and the children, who left the house in the morning. But instead of taking Loris to school, the woman turned him back home. He was no longer visible on the recordings. Then Veronica took the younger child to the kindergarten and returned. Contrary to her habit, she drove into the garage in reverse rather than leaving the car in front of the house. According to the investigators, it was at this time between 9 and 10 in the morning that the crime occurred. Loris was not at school and stayed at home, and when his mother drove into the garage, she was doing something out of the camera's view. Despite all the evidence, Veronica continued to deny her guilt, insisting that she had taken her elder son to school and her younger son to kindergarten, after which she returned home. She suggested that Loris could have been kidnapped right outside the school. But the police did not believe this because they saw on the video how at 9:23 Veronica left the house again, and just 2 minutes later she was heading towards the old mill, where her son's body was soon found. Returning home at 9:38, she was definitely alone. Given the speed of events, the boy most likely was no longer breathing when he was thrown into the ditch. At 9:41, Veronica was already on her way to her usual cooking classes. She left early to arrive by the start of classes at 10 in the morning and not arouse suspicion. There, no one noticed any changes in her behavior. GPS data from Veronica's phone and car confirmed her movements established by the investigators. Unfortunately, the collected evidence was not yet sufficient for an official accusation, so the young mother was simply placed under arrest, and law enforcement officers continued to search for irrefutable evidence. At some point, it seemed that the suspect was about to be exposed, but suddenly, a policewoman who was on duty near the school turned to the station. She claimed that she had seen Veronica dropping Loris off at the educational institution on the day of the murder. However, the investigators did not trust these statements too much because they contradicted the video recordings. The policewoman could have simply confused the days since Veronica performed the same actions every morning. Meanwhile, the main suspect was behind bars, desperately proving her innocence. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown. When the carabinieri told David about the discrepancies in his wife's route, he also acknowledged her behavior as suspicious and sided with the investigation. The police saw this as an opportune moment to obtain a confession. They understood that the suspect most likely trusted her husband, so they decided to arrange a meeting between them, during which Davide would try to elicit some new details from his wife. After all, Veronica was the only person who had complete information about the events of that tragic morning. David agreed that it was a good idea, but noted that he did not seek his wife's conviction. 1 month after the brutal murder of 8-year-old Loris Stival, on January 6, 2015, his father David came to meet with his arrested wife Veronica. Despite the fact that according to Italian law he had no right to be in prison, the police made an exception, hoping that it would help solve the crime. Veronica didn't even greet her husband, but immediately asked if he had a microphone for eavesdropping. Davide denied it and proved the absence of any recording devices. In fact, they were not needed because the meeting was being filmed by a prison surveillance camera. The suspect continued to insist on her innocence and version of events. She incessantly repeated to everyone, the police, the lawyer, her husband, relatives who visited her in prison, that she had taken her son to school and did not know what had happened to him next. The detectives could not prove the mother's involvement in the massacre. Even the motive itself raised doubts. Everyone who knew Veronica characterized her as a decent woman who sincerely loved her sons. Of course, there were various rumors, but the investigators checked every word and found no confirmation of the gossip. Veronica was indeed a caring mother. The only lead that seemed plausible to the detectives to explain the crime could be depression or emotional instability. The main suspect was indeed in a very depressed state, which only worsened due to her imprisonment. The investigation had reached a dead end, and it occurred to the investigators to allow the mother to visit the child's grave to say goodbye to him. Veronica was taken to the cemetery, accompanied by a whole motorcade of 10 cars with flashing lights on. It seemed as if a dangerous maniac was being transported through the city. A listening device was installed on the tombstone, of course. The officers were sure that by leaving the mother alone with her deceased son, they would hear an apology or a confession of murder. And Veronica started talking. But these were not at all the words that the police expected to hear. She was sobbing, praying, and swearing that she knew her boy's killer and would punish him. This came as a complete surprise to the carabinieri. Later, she was put in a car to be taken back to her cell. On the way, the young mother suddenly reported that at her son's grave she had some kind of insight. She admitted that she had begun to recall the events of that fatal day, which had previously eluded her memory. However, Veronica was not going to share this with the detectives. Instead, she expressed a desire to meet with her husband again. On November 6, 2015, David visited Veronica again. Of course, like all visits behind prison walls, this meeting was also recorded. This time, the main suspect admitted for the first time that she thought she had not taken the child to school at all on the day of his disappearance. The woman complained about difficulties in expressing her thoughts as she found herself in an unusual state. According to Veronica, that morning she seemed to have fallen out of reality and everything around her seemed shrouded in fog. From her fragmentary memories, she was able to recreate how she took her younger son to kindergarten and then returned home, where Loris was supposed to be. She left her elder son at home because he did not want to go to school. But when she returned, Veronica did not find the boy. Being in a strange state, she thought that she had already taken him to school, but realized her mistake when she came to pick up the child from school, and he was not there. The police, of course, did not believe the new version, but were convinced that they were moving in the right direction. It almost resembled the very confession they had needed for a whole year to bring the killer to justice. They considered her excuse of memory loss an attempt to mitigate her guilt and get a shorter sentence than she deserved. However, not everyone shared this point of view, since the woman's condition really caused concern. Unfortunately, the younger son was still too young and could not testify to the police about whether he had seen his brother that day. Despite their confidence in Veronica's involvement in the murder, the carabinieri decided to meet her halfway and suggested going home in the hope that it would help unlock new memories. She was led through the rooms, which remained unchanged from the day of the boy's death. When the main suspect entered Loris's room, something theatrical began to happen. She started speaking in her son's voice and reproducing the dialogues that she allegedly had with him that morning. The detectives saw how emotionlessly she was doing it, and at that moment they became convinced that before them was a true pathological liar and manipulator who was once again trying to lead the investigation away from the truth. But could she, being in her right mind, have been deceiving everyone for more than a year? During this time, dozens of specialists had spoken with the suspect. Despite the fact that the police officers were not sure about the reliability of the new version of events told by the young mother, many still believe in it to this day. According to Veronica, after returning home from the kindergarten, she started washing baby bottles. Her elder son Loris did not want to go to school, so the woman allowed him to spend the whole day at home. While the mother was doing household chores, the boy was in his room. Veronica did not hear anything suspicious, but when she entered her son's room sometime later, she saw his blue body with cable ties tightened around his neck. The child had probably been playing with them and tried to tighten them around his neck. The ties were connected to each other like a necklace. As the woman recounted, her son froze with frightened eyes. He was pulling on one of the ends of the ties, thinking that this way he would be able to open them, but in fact, he was only tightening the deadly trap even more. The mother knew how they worked, but realized that she would not be able to tear them apart with her hands, so she ran to the kitchen for scissors. When the story's heroine returned and cut the fatal ribbon,
the boy was no longer showing signs of life. He had lost consciousness and was not breathing. According to Veronica's confession, she had a panic attack. She immediately took her cell phone and tried to dial the emergency service number. However, she was shaking so much that she simply could not dial the number. Her fingers were missing the buttons, and the numbers were blurring before her eyes. After all this, Veronica realized that she would be the one blamed for what had happened. Being in an inadequate state, she decided to get rid of her son's body. Later, the forensic medical examination confirmed the presence of scratches on the child's face and neck. They resembled real attempts to tear off the cable ties from him with fingernails. Unfortunately, the ties had cut too deep into the skin, so it was impossible to tear them off with hands. According to the investigators, in a panic, the mother could have pulled on one of the ends of the ties herself, which further aggravated the situation and finally cut off the access to oxygen. At this stage, the police decided to clarify the information and, if possible, awaken new memories, so Veronica and Davide were again taken to the place where Loris was found. Here, the mother admitted that she had indeed thrown the child into the ravine, but continued to deny that she had dealt with him herself. She still could not explain why the boy had no underwear. This circumstance did not fit into her story in any way. It also raised great doubts as to why an 8-year-old intelligent child would put these ties around his neck, tighten them more and more, and not even call for help. Later, the suspect recalled that the ravine turned out to be too deep, so the pants accidentally slipped off the body, and it twisted as the boy rolled to the bottom. At the trial, the prosecution tried to refute the mother's confession. Her uncharacteristic behavior was the most alarming. Veronica parked the car in the garage in a very unusual way, so that it was really convenient to load the body unnoticed. However, this happened at a moment when she could not yet have known about her son's death. According to her confession, he died later. In the opinion of the prosecution, this indicated the intentional nature of the murder. The defense continued to insist that the mother did not kill the child, but that he himself died due to negligence. Realizing the severity of what had happened, Veronica simply got scared. The woman was in a state of shock, so she took the body out and threw it away. However, she could not answer one of the key questions. The prosecution could not understand why she took the underwear off the boy and then put his pants back on. According to Veronica, she simply did not remember this. The prosecutor considered her actions an attempt to stage an attack on the boy by a rape in order to lead the investigation along the wrong path. Initially, her plan worked, and the police were looking for such a criminal. But later they realized that it was part of the staging. During the trial of this case, an unexpected plot twist emerged. Veronica admitted that Loris was killed by the boy's grandfather on his father's side, named Andrea Stival. She allegedly had an affair with her husband's father. That day, the child caught them having sex and began to threaten that he would tell his father everything. Andrea Stival, the boy's paternal grandfather, allegedly attacked his grandson in a fit of anger and strangled him. Despite this strange turn of events, law enforcement officers were forced to check the accused's statement. They turned to the surveillance camera recordings again. Thus, the investigators found out that none of the men had entered the house that morning. However, in the footage where Veronica was leaving the house around 9:30, a dark silhouette was indeed visible in the back seat of the car. The Carabinieri were forced to involve specialists for the analysis of the video recordings, but they claimed that it was not the shadow of a person, but glare on the car windows. Andrea Stival himself denied both the connection with his son's wife and the murder of his grandson. He stated that this was another lie of a crazy woman. The grandfather had a confirmed alibi. In addition, there was no correspondence or even calls between the so-called lovers, which also refuted Veronica's words. Therefore, no one believed this new version of the defendant. Veronica's behavior suggested that the investigation was dealing with a person with mental disorders. Her strange behavior was emphasized by all the officers and specialists who communicated with her. One of the detectives recalled that during one of the interrogations, the woman suddenly began to sing. And also repeatedly her calm and loud speech changed to an indistinct mumbling under her breath with a blank look. Veronica seemed to periodically fall out of reality and could start smoking an imaginary cigarette. The defendant's mother said that Veronica had previously had mental problems. From an early age, she was repeatedly sexually abused by boys. At the age of 14, the girl tried to take her own life by drinking bleach after a quarrel with her school friends. The following year, she tried to hang herself in a greenhouse. Veronica underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic. Once she called her mother and asked her to pick her up because the paramedic had allegedly raped her. But these accusations did not receive any confirmation, and no one believed the girl. A psychiatric examination showed that Veronica acted in a cold-blooded, prudent, and cruel manner. No serious mental disorders were found in her that would allow her to be declared insane. The trial lasted a whole 4 years due to constant postponements and additional investigations. Based on the results of the trial, she was found guilty of premeditated murder and concealment of the body. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. After that, another performance took place. Obviously, the child's grandfather, whom Veronica referred to as the criminal, was in the courtroom. The defendant did not agree with the verdict, so she stood up and again began to accuse the man of all those absurd things that she had already voiced earlier in court. She was removed from the courtroom and sent behind bars. Veronica is still in prison, keeping the terrible truth of the death of the 8-year-old boy, which we will probably never know. However, most of the investigators who worked on this case believe that it was not an accident, but a planned, brutal murder. Probably, on that day, the son did not want to go to school. This had happened before. It was not the first case of him skipping. On this basis, the mother quarreled with her son and strangled him with ties in a fit of anger, and then got rid of the body, deliberately removed his underwear to confuse the investigation. But since the ties were purchased in advance, perhaps it all looked even more ominous and indicated the planning of the murder. The boy's father stated after the trial that his life was destroyed because he had simultaneously lost his son, wife, and job. The man is still not sure that it was Veronica who killed the boy. He did not understand what could have been the reason for killing his son. David had never seen his wife display violence towards the children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he is trying to live for the sake of his younger son, in whose upbringing his parents are helping him. The story of Veronica Panarello and her son Loris is a tragic tale of how impulsive decisions, lack of maturity, and emotional instability can lead to devastating consequences. This case serves as a cautionary tale for all parents about the importance of responsible parenting and the need to overcome one's own psychological issues for the safety and well-being of their family. The main cause of this tragedy was Veronica's inability to cope with the challenges of motherhood at such a young age. Her emotional immaturity, possible mental disorders, and lack of proper support from loved ones created a dangerous combination of factors that ultimately led to the child's death. To prevent such tragedies, it is crucial that young parents have access to the resources and support necessary for raising children. This includes parenting education, emotional support, counseling, and assistance in case of psychological issues. Society as a whole should pay more attention to the mental health and well-being of families, especially those facing additional challenges such as early and unplanned pregnancies. People are capable of horrific acts towards one another, but what could be worse than the cruelty of one's own parents? This is a story about Lacy, a girl whose life was cut short due to the inhumane conditions in which she was kept by her closest relatives. Lacy, we don't know much about her as she rarely appeared in public. According to neighbors' recollections, she was a cheerful, inquisitive child. She was passionate about volleyball, loved watching Disney cartoons, and listening to country music. A typical girl with a carefree childhood. But everything changed when Lacy turned 9. Her family, consisting of her mother Sheila and father Clay, decided to move to a new home in the town of Slaughter, Louisiana. Little did they know that this house would become a real prison for their daughter. When Lacy was supposed to start 9th grade, her parents suddenly decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for the girl, but in reality it marked the beginning of her isolation from the outside world. I want you to imagine being locked within the four walls of your own house, without the opportunity to interact with peers, go to school, develop and explore the world. This is the situation young Lacy found herself in, and no one even suspected her suffering. What motivated Sheila and Clay to make such a choice? Did they realize the consequences of their actions? These questions remain unanswered to this day. But one thing is certain, their decision forever changed Lacy's life and led to tragic events. Moving to a new house and switching to homeschooling seemingly ordinary things that shouldn't raise suspicions. But in this case, they became the first steps towards the girl's horrific fate. So at the time of being transferred to homeschooling, Lacy was about 14 years old. It was during this period that her life turned into a real nightmare. The girl found herself in complete isolation from the outside world. As it turned out later, Lacy suffered from autism and a severe form of social phobia. These diagnoses became a life sentence for her. Over the years, the illness progressed and the girl increasingly immersed herself in her own world, shutting herself off from reality. It can be assumed that it was precisely due to the exacerbation of Lacy's condition that her parents decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for her, that she would feel safer in a home environment. But did they realize the consequences this isolation would lead to? Imagine a teenager who is afraid to step outside their own house, who doesn't have the opportunity to interact with peers, make friends, explore the world. For Lacy, with her diagnosis, it was a real ordeal. She found herself trapped by her own fears and limitations. But this is just the beginning of the tragedies the girl had to face. A girl who needed help and support found herself in complete isolation. And most terrifying of all, it happened through the fault of her own parents. Why didn't Sheila and Clay seek professional help for their daughter? Why did they decide that homeschooling and isolation were the solution? I want you, the one watching this video right now, to know that it's important to be attentive to those who need our help and support. Perhaps if someone had intervened, if someone had reached out to help Lacy, her fate would have been different. Years passed and Lacy became increasingly invisible to those around her. Neighbors who once frequently saw her on the street could now barely remember when they last encountered the girl. It was as if she had vanished behind the walls of her own house. Meanwhile, her parents, Sheila and Clay, continued to live their usual lives. Sheila worked as a court and police clerk and also had a small bakery nearby. It seemed like nothing special, just an ordinary job. But later, just before her daughter's death, Sheila got a job as an assistant prosecutor in Zachary and even became a member of the Slaughter City Council. A successful career, isn't it? And Lacy's father, Clay, was a respected member of the community. He represented the non-profit organization Civil War Round Table and was part of the Rotary Club. People respected him for his active community involvement and participation in city life. The Fletchers were an ordinary family that didn't stand out in any particular way. They regularly attended the local church like many other town residents. No one could have imagined that behind the closed doors of their house, something terrible was happening. I often encounter situations where people are not always what they seem at first glance. Outwardly, the Fletchers were a respectable family, active members of the community. They didn't raise any suspicions or questions. But as it turned out, it was all just an illusion. While Lacy suffered in complete isolation, her parents continued to live their normal lives. They went to work, interacted with people, participated in community affairs. Meanwhile, their daughter was slowly fading away within four walls, without hope of rescue. Friends, creating this type of content requires a lot of time, and right now my channel and I are going through a challenging financial situation. I would be immensely grateful if you could become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to your comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become a sponsor. I will be eternally grateful to you. From the moment Lacy was transferred to homeschooling, years passed, and the girl practically disappeared from the sight of those around her. During all this time, she was seen outside the house only once when she was 20 years old. A random passerby noticed Lacy exercising near her parents' house. Perhaps at that time, she still had a bit of freedom and strength to go out into the yard. The Fletcher's neighbor, Robert Blatz, was the last person to see Lacy alive. He recounted that he once spoke with Clay about the girl. He inquired about how she was doing and where she had gone, as she hadn't been seen for a long time. To which Clay briefly replied that his daughter lived with them, she was in the house, and quickly changed the subject. At the time, it didn't raise any suspicions for Robert. He likely knew about Lacy's social phobia and her health issues, so he didn't press further. Moreover, the Fletcher family had an impeccable reputation among neighbors. They were respected members of the community, and nothing indicated any possible trouble. From the perspective of my years lived and experience working in the police force, I often wonder how many tragedies could have been prevented if people were more attentive and caring. In this case, too, the neighbor inquired, received an answer that essentially clarified nothing and left it at that. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions, didn't become alarmed, didn't turn to the appropriate services. Of course, I don't blame Robert. He couldn't have known what was happening behind the closed doors at the Fletcher's house. But it makes one think about how often we, caught up in our own affairs and problems, simply don't notice the warning signs. We don't pay attention to the strange behavior of neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances. We consider it none of our business. Lacy practically vanished from the life of the community, and it didn't bother anyone. The girl who once played on the street and interacted with neighbors suddenly became invisible, and everyone accepted it as a given. One can only imagine the despair and loneliness Lacy experienced during those years. She was imprisoned not only physically within the walls of her own home, but also emotionally in the indifference and blindness of those around her. January 3, 2022, forever changed the lives of the Fletcher family and shook the entire local community. That day, Sheila called the police with a report that was difficult to comprehend. Her 36-year-old daughter Lacy had stopped breathing. How could this have happened? What had been going on in that house all these years while Lacy was isolated from the world? Rumors immediately began to circulate around this incident. Some claimed that Sheila dared to call the police only because someone from the neighbors was in their house at that moment. Allegedly, the very fact of an outsider's presence forced her to act. Otherwise, she would have continued to remain silent. One of the Fletcher's neighbors, who claimed to be in their house on that fateful day, said that Sheila would hardly have called the police if not for his presence. This leads one to wonder whether it was an attempt by the mother to conceal the traces of her terrible negligence and indifference. What really happened on that January day? I'm afraid we will never know all the details. The only thing known for certain is that Lacy was found dead in her own bed, in a house that should have been a cozy shelter for her, but instead became a place of suffering and death. The following days and weeks were filled with investigations, interrogations, and examinations. Local residents whispered and shared speculations, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet communities. However, no one could even imagine the full depth of the tragedy unfolding behind the walls of the Fletcher's house. Frankly, I have seen a lot of human grief and cruelty, but Lacy's story shocked me. Lacy's death marked the beginning of a long and painful process of seeking truth and justice. What law enforcement officers and medics saw in the Fletcher's house that January day will forever remain in their memory. In the living room on the couch, they discovered the body of 36-year-old Lacy Ellen Fletcher, who had been lying there for the last 12 years of her life. The scene that opened before their eyes was horrific. Lacy's body was disfigured by pressure sores, which had likely formed from prolonged contact with the surface of the couch. Her skin was covered in ulcers and her own excrement, indicating a complete absence of basic hygiene and care. The most shocking aspect was that insect larvae and rat droppings covered the girl's body. This suggested that she had literally rotted alive in that spot without any assistance or intervention. Medical experts who examined Lacy's body noted that she had literally grown into the couch. It's possible that the girl had not gotten up from it for so long that her muscles had atrophied and her skin had fused with the surface of the furniture. Lacy's legs were bent under her body in an unnatural position, indicating her immobility for an extended period. At the time of her death, Lacy was wearing only a dirty, tattered t-shirt. She weighed a mere 43 kilograms, which was catastrophically low for an adult woman of her height. Most likely, the girl suffered from severe malnutrition and dehydration, which led to her death. Some sources also reported that the autopsy results revealed the presence of coronavirus in Lacy's body. This was surprising because, according to the testimonies of neighbors and relatives, the only people the girl had contact with in recent years were her own parents. The question arose, could they have been the ones to infect their daughter during the pandemic? When cops began investigating the circumstances of Lacy Fletcher's death, one of the key questions was, what had caused her demise? The answer that investigators received from medical experts was shocking. According to the coroner, Dr. Hasbrook Mims, Lacy had fallen victim to serious medical neglect by her caregivers, her own parents. For years, they had disregarded their daughter's basic needs, leading to a whole range of health problems. Due to chronic malnutrition and acute starvation, Lacy's body was depleted, deprived of vital nutrients. Her muscles had atrophied due to prolonged immobility, resulting in the formation of pressure sores and ulcers on her body. But the most terrifying aspect was that at some point, Lacy developed osteomyelitis, an infectious inflammation of the bone tissue. The pathogens had likely entered her body through open wounds and ulcers. Without proper treatment, the infection spread throughout her body, causing sepsis, a life-threatening reaction of the body to inflammation. Law enforcement also studied information that Lacy might have suffered from locked-in syndrome, also known as pseudocoma. According to some accounts, the girl seemed to be in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak, although her consciousness was alert. But Dr. Hasbrought Mims refuted these assumptions, noting that apart from the previously diagnosed autism and social phobia, no other neurological disorders were detected in Lacy. It is striking that Lacy's last documented visit to a doctor occurred when she was only 16 years old. Just imagine, 20 years without proper medical supervision, without basic checkups and tests. During this time, any disease could have developed and led to fatal consequences. I cannot comprehend how parents could allow their daughter to end up in such a terrible state. After all, they lived with her under the same roof, saw her every day. Were they so blind or indifferent as to not notice the obvious signs of illness and decline? Of course, one could refer to Lacy's mental state, her social phobia, and reluctance to contact the outside world. But this is no excuse for the parents. It was their duty to provide their daughter with proper care and treatment, even if it meant resorting to coercive measures. In May 2022, after a thorough investigation into the circumstances of Lacy Fletcher's death, her parents, Sheila and Clay, were formally charged with second-degree murder. This was the first step towards justice for the girl who had suffered in silence for so many years. Despite the severity of the crime, they spent only 36 hours behind bars. Imagine, accused of their own daughter's death, they were released on bail of $300,000 each. This amount may seem enormous to the average person, but for a couple who held quite high positions in the local community, it wasn't that much. Of course, releasing suspects on bail is a common practice in our justice system. But in this case, it was difficult to come to terms with the fact that people who had brought their own daughter to such a horrible state could calmly await trial in the comfort of their own home. However, even the highest bail could not soften the shock and outrage that gripped the jurors when they were shown footage from the crime scene and photographs of Lacy's body during the court session. Imagine people's reactions to these chilling images. Some couldn't hold back tears, while others turned away, unable to look at the screen. Even experienced lawyers and law enforcement officers who had seen plenty of brutality in their practice were stunned by the extent of suffering Lacy had endured. This evidence became irrefutable proof of the inhumane conditions in which the girl had lived the last years of her life. The jurors saw with their own eyes the pressure sores and ulcers on her body, the insects and rodents that had infested her bed, the filth and neglect of the room where she had spent her final days. During interrogations, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction and negligence in caring for their daughter. They told detectives that Lacy suffered from autism and an extremely severe form of social phobia, which only worsened over the years. According to their account, the girl was terrified of leaving the confines of the house and avoided any contact with the outside world. Allegedly, this was why she stayed in her room around the clock, refusing even to get up from the couch. The Fletchers claimed that the crisis in Lacy's condition occurred when she was a little over 20. The girl had supposedly disappeared, completely entirely isolating herself, losing any desire for communication and activity. She would allegedly scream and throw tantrums when someone tried to persuade her to leave her comfort zone. Clay and Sheila insisted that they had made attempts to help their daughter. They claimed to have tried to lift her from the couch, force her to move, but it only worsened the situation. Lacy would allegedly fall into such severe stress and aggression that the parents were simply afraid to change anything. Particularly cynical were Sheila's words about how Lacy never complained about the precious sores and wounds that festered on her emaciated body. The mother claimed that she regularly examined and treated these ulcers, but the girl allegedly didn't want to be bothered. On the one hand, I understood that raising and caring for a child with such serious mental disorders is indeed a difficult challenge for parents.
No one is immune to the possibility of the illness progressing and complicating life for the entire family. But on the other hand, before the investigators sat two adult, educated people who had essentially watched their daughter die in her own home slowly, in agony, in filth and loneliness. I couldn't and didn't want to find excuses for them. Even if Lacy truly refused help and contact, shouldn't the parents have taken more decisive measures? Seek medical assistance, call in specialists, resort to involuntary hospitalization? After all, it was a matter of their own child's life and health. Instead, they watched their daughter's slow agony for years. They watched as she died alive among her own waste. And this was despite the fact that they themselves led quite active social lives, pursued careers, and attended church. Throughout the investigation and trial, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction by claiming that Lacy was an adult
and therefore had the right to make her own decisions about her life. They argued that the girl had consciously chosen to remain confined to the couch, refusing any activity or assistance. According to the parents' version, they simply accepted their daughter's choice and allowed her to exist in this way. They claimed that Lacy had retained mental clarity and the ability to communicate until her last day, which meant she could have changed her situation if she had wanted to. The Fletchers insisted that they suspected nothing, as they had last seen their daughter alive. They allegedly found her dead when they returned home after a weekend trip. But these statements raised serious doubts for me as an investigator. After all, the condition in which Lacy's body was found clearly indicated that the girl had been dying in bed for more than one day, surrounded by filth, parasites, and her own waste. It couldn't have happened suddenly, over a single weekend. The parents were well aware of their daughter's vulnerable mental state, but had not taken any measures for years to provide her with proper care and treatment. They had every opportunity to take Lacy to a doctor, turn to the appropriate services, arrange for hospitalization, or at least hire a caregiver. Instead, they simply left the helpless woman to fend for herself, dooming her to a slow and painful death. And even when the couple allegedly went on vacation, leaving their mentally ill daughter alone in such a pitiful state, it already amounted to criminal negligence. They should have been aware of the risks and responsibilities they carried as guardians of an incapacitated person. The defense tried to touch the jurors with the image of parents supposedly grieving for their prematurely deceased daughter. They hoped that the respected status of the family and the Fletchers' active community involvement would play in their favor. But the prosecution understood that a cruel truth was hidden behind the mask of respectability, and our task was to bring this truth to the court and secure a just punishment. The prosecutor insisted on a thorough investigation of all the circumstances of the case and the appropriate classification of the Fletchers' crime. In our opinion, their actions fell under the article second-degree murder and should be punished with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And so, after months of investigation, dozens of witness interrogations, examinations, and fierce court battles, we finally reached the denouement of this chilling story. The jury, having heard all the evidence and arguments of the parties, found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of murdering their daughter Lacy through criminal negligence and inhumane treatment. Witnesses remember the tense silence that fell over the courtroom when the presiding judge announced the verdict. It seemed as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation, and when the words "life imprisonment without the possibility of parole" were uttered, one could hear dozens of people sighing with relief in that silence. Justice had finally prevailed, but the joy of victory was overshadowed by the realization of the full tragedy of the situation. Lacy, an innocent, defenseless girl who suffered from severe illnesses, had become a victim of the cruelty and selfishness of those who should have surrounded her with love and care. She died in agony, in complete loneliness, not understanding why such a fate had befallen her. During the announcement of the verdict, a heavy atmosphere filled with grief reigned in the courtroom. People were not ashamed of their tears, not hiding their shock and indignation. The journalists present seemed to not seek sensational headlines. For the first time in many years, they simply silently honored Lacy's memory. I believe that this story was not in vain. The Lacy Fletcher case shook the entire country, forcing people to think about the problems that had remained in the shadows until now. Community activists and concerned citizens rallied to push for changes in the system of protecting the rights of people with disabilities and mental disorders. Thanks to this tragedy, serious discussions began at the state level about guardianship of incapacitated individuals, the accessibility of medical and social assistance, and monitoring the observance of the rights of vulnerable population groups. And although there is still much work ahead, we have moved from a dead end and taken the first steps towards a more humane and responsible society. I know that the memory of Lacy will live on in the hearts of all who empathize with this tragic story. This story took place in 2007 in the Italian city of Perugia, where Amanda went as part of a student exchange program. Amanda settled into an apartment with 3 other girls, including British student Meredith Kircher. Initially, everything was going well. Amanda was learning Italian, making new friends, and working at a local bar. She was a typical student who wanted to gain new experiences and enjoy life in another country. But on November 1, 2007, a tragedy occurred that would forever change Amanda's life. Her roommate Meredith was found dead in their shared apartment. The girl was partially undressed, with deep cuts on her neck. It was clear that this was a brutal murder. The police immediately launched an investigation and began searching for possible suspects. Unfortunately, their attention quickly focused on Amanda and her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito. Investigators found some evidence that, in their opinion, pointed to the couple's involvement in the crime. This was the beginning of a long and complicated case that lasted many years and attracted worldwide attention. Amanda found herself at the center of the scandal and was accused of brutally murdering her friend. Her life turned into a real nightmare. There are many controversial moments and ambiguous facts in this case. Various pieces of evidence were presented, some of which raised doubts about their reliability. Testimonies were often inconsistent and confusing. Public opinion was divided. Some believed in Amanda's guilt, while others considered her an innocent victim. There are still many details and twists ahead in this story. We will learn more about Amanda's personality, the course of the investigation and the trial, the role of the media and the public in this case. We will try to figure out what really happened on that terrible night and whether the verdict was fair. So let's unravel this tangle of mysteries and riddles together, step by step. Perhaps we will be able to find answers to some questions and understand what Amanda Knox's true role was in this tragic story. So, let's learn more about Amanda Knox before she found herself at the center of this high-profile case. Amanda was born on July 9, 1987, in Seattle, Washington, USA. She grew up in an ordinary American family, not particularly standing out from her peers. From childhood, Amanda showed an interest in learning different languages and cultures. She was an active and sociable girl who easily made new acquaintances. At school, Amanda was particularly interested in literature and foreign languages, which later influenced her choice of future profession. After graduating from high school, Amanda entered the University of Washington, where she began studying Italian. It was this fascination with Italian that became one of the main reasons why she decided to go to Italy to study. Amanda devoted her university years not only to studying, but also to actively participating in student life, joining various youth communities and interest groups. In 2007, Knox learned about a student exchange program that allowed her to spend a whole year in Italy. She immediately decided to take this opportunity and chose the city of Perugia as her destination, one of the oldest university centers in Italy, known for its rich history and culture. For a young girl who wanted to improve her knowledge of Italian and immerse herself in an authentic environment, Perugia seemed like the perfect place. Before leaving for Italy, Amanda had already earned a reputation as a diligent student and an active participant in university life. She not only studied well, but also found time for social activities and volunteering. Amanda participated in various student clubs, especially those related to the study of foreign languages and intercultural exchange. Amanda's interest in Italy was not limited to language and literature. She was fascinated by Italian art, cuisine, and traditions. Amanda dreamed of seeing the masterpieces of Italian artists with her own eyes, tasting real pasta and pizza, and communicating with locals. She was confident that a year in Italy would be an unforgettable adventure for her and would help not only improve her language skills, but also better understand herself and the world around her. Unfortunately, fate had completely different plans for Knox. What was supposed to be a year of dreams turned into the worst nightmare of her life. No one, including Amanda herself, could have imagined the ordeals that awaited her in Perugia and how one tragic event would forever change her fate. So this was Amanda Knox before finding herself at the center of the most high-profile criminal case of the decade. An ordinary girl from an ordinary American family who just wanted to study, develop, and explore the world. She had no idea that very soon her name would be on the front pages of all the world's newspapers, but for far from pleasant reasons. In the summer of 2007, she finally arrived in the long-awaited Perugia, a small but incredibly picturesque city in the heart of Umbria. Amanda settled into a cozy apartment that she shared with 3 other girls, including British student Meredith Kircher. Meredith, like Amanda, came to Italy on a student exchange program. It would seem that the 2 young foreigners had a lot in common: young age, love of travel, desire to learn about another culture. At first, the girls got along well, sharing impressions of their new life and making plans for the future. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The first weeks in Perugia were a real fairy tale for Amanda. She immersed herself in the local student life, attending lectures at the university, participating in various events, meeting new people. Amanda continued to improve her Italian not only in classes, but also in live communication with locals. Her energy, openness, and genuine interest in everything new helped her quickly adapt to life in a foreign country. To have her own pocket money, Amanda got a job at the Le Chic Bar, which was owned by Patrick Lumumba, a native of Congo. This job gave her the opportunity not only to earn a little money, but also to delve deeper into the atmosphere of the city and meet different people. It was at this bar that Amanda met her new boyfriend, a young Italian named Rafael Soacido. It seemed that everything was going as well as possible. But despite the carefree first months, Knox had to get used to some peculiarities of life in Italy that differed from the American way of life she was used to. A different culture, a different rhythm of life, different rules of the game, all this required some effort and time to adapt. But Amanda, with her curiosity and love of life, gladly accepted these challenges. However, fate was already preparing completely different trials for Amanda. On November 1, 2007, her roommate Meredith Kircher was found brutally murdered in their shared apartment. This tragedy came as a real shock to everyone and completely turned Amanda's life upside down. From a carefree student, she instantly turned into the main suspect in a terrible crime. Thus began a long and complicated story that would define Amanda Knox's fate for years to come and make her name known all over the world. A story full of riddles, contradictions, and unexpected twists. A story about how a dream can turn into a nightmare, and an ordinary life can turn into a courtroom thriller. What really happened on that fatal night? Was Amanda really involved in the murder of her friend? The answers to these questions were sought for many years, and we will return to them more than once. On November 1, 2007, in the apartment in Perugia where Amanda Knox lived with other female students, a terrible tragedy occurred. Meredith Kircher, one of Amanda's roommates, was found dead in her room. Her body was covered with numerous wounds, and deep cuts were visible on her neck, indicating an extremely brutal murder. This shocking event not only stunned the entire student dormitory, but also shook the entire local community. Perugia, known for its calm and safe university town atmosphere, suddenly found itself in the spotlight due to one of the most high-profile crimes in Italian history. The police immediately launched an investigation. The main task of the first days was to reconstruct the picture of events on that fatal night, to understand what exactly happened in the apartment and who could have committed such a brutal murder. Investigators began questioning everyone who was in any way connected with Meredith, primarily her roommates, including Amanda Knox, and very quickly, the attention of the police and the public focused on Amanda. Why? Because some details in her behavior and testimony aroused suspicion. For example, there were certain inconsistencies in her stories about where she was and what she was doing that night. The police were also alerted by Amanda's unusual, in their opinion, reactions to what had happened. In addition to Amanda, her boyfriend, Italian Raffaele Solicito, also fell under suspicion. Investigators collected some evidence that, in their opinion, pointed to the couple's possible involvement in the crime. In particular, during a search of Raffaele's apartment, a knife was confiscated on which traces of blood were found, and on the bra of the murdered Meredith, experts found Raffaele's DNA. These findings later became some of the key pieces of evidence for the prosecutions. However, as it turned out later, the investigation also had significant shortcomings. Many experts criticized the methods of collecting and processing physical evidence, pointing out the possibility of their accidental or intentional contamination during investigative actions. This called into question the reliability and admissibility of some of the evidence. Meanwhile, the case was gaining more and more publicity. A real media frenzy erupted around the investigation. The media around the world began closely following every move of the police, relishing the details and putting forward their own versions of events. Against the backdrop of this unhealthy interest and constant pressure, Amanda and Raffaele found themselves at the center of a real storm that mixed real facts with speculation and rumors. This atmosphere of public hysteria and bias created very difficult conditions for conducting a fair and impartial investigation and trial. And although at that time no one knew how this story would end, it was clear that it would not be an easy walk for any of the participants. Thus, the tragic death of Meredith Kircher marked the beginning of one of the most complicated and controversial criminal cases in modern history. A case that became a real test for the justice system and raised more questions than it gave answers. And although we now know its finale, believe me, the path to the truth was very long and winding. On November 6, 2007, just a few days after the brutal murder of Meredith Kircher, Amanda Knox and her boyfriend Raffaele Solicito were arrested. This step by the Italian police was the result of the evidence collected, which investigators considered convincing enough to bring charges. Among this evidence were certain discrepancies in the suspects' statements regarding their whereabouts and actions on the night of the murder. The police also referred to some physical evidence found at the crime scene that allegedly pointed to Amanda and Raffaele's involvement in this tragedy. In addition to them, Patrick Lumumba, the owner of the bar where Amanda worked, was also arrested. The reason for his arrest was a mention of him in one of Amanda's first statements. However, she later claimed that she gave this testimony under pressure from the investigators. The case instantly attracted enormous attention from the international community. At the center of this media storm was Amanda Knox, a young American who, in the eyes of the public, turned from a gifted student into the main suspect in a brutal murder. The media dubbed her Foxy Knoxy and began to portray her as a cunning and dangerous person. This biased presentation of information further complicated an already difficult case. The trial began in 2008. Prosecutors presented their version of events. According to their theory, Amanda, Raphael, and another man, Rudy Ged, a native of Ivory Coast who had already been convicted of this crime in a separate trial, committed the murder of Meredith during some kind of perverted sex game that got out of control. The prosecution relied on physical evidence from the crime scene and the suspect's testimonies, which contained many inconsistencies and strange details. On the other hand, Amanda Knox's lawyers insisted that her initial confessions were obtained under duress, and all the evidence against her was collected in violation of procedure and could have been contaminated during processing. The defense also emphasized that Amanda's DNA was not found on key pieces of physical evidence, such as the murder weapon. In addition, the defense subjected the methods of conducting the investigation and the entire Italian justice system to scathing criticism, claiming numerous violations of the suspect's rights to a fair trial. Meanwhile, the public was divided in its assessments of this complicated case. A significant part of Italian society was inclined to believe in the guilt of Amanda and Raphael. On the other hand, in the USA, the prevailing opinion was that the young people were being unfairly persecuted and that the real perpetrators of this terrible crime were not the ones on the dock. These contradictory judgments and polarity of opinions created an extremely tense atmosphere around the trial. It seemed that finding the truth in this tangle of mutually exclusive facts and conjectures would be extremely difficult. And although at that moment the finale of this drama was not yet known, it was clear to everyone that a long and exhausting struggle lay ahead for Amanda, Raphael, and their loved ones. The trial of Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito was a real test for the Italian justice system. It took place under the close attention of the world media and was accompanied by fierce public debates. The focus was on the evidence collected by the prosecution, as well as how this evidence was presented and interpreted by prosecutors and lawyers. The prosecution placed particular emphasis on several key elements. Firstly, the presence of Raphael Solicito's DNA on the clasp of the murdered Meredith Kircher's bra. Prosecutors argued that this finding was irrefutable proof of Raphael's presence at the crime scene at the time of the murder. Secondly, the investigation emphasized the mixed DNA samples of Amanda and Meredith found in the bathroom of their shared apartment. These traces, according to the prosecution, indicated that Amanda was present during the attack on Meredith or immediately after it and tried to cover up the traces. Thirdly, the prosecutors painted a rather unflattering psychological portrait of Amanda Knox. They portrayed her as a cold, calculating, and manipulative person. To support this characterization, they cited evidence of Amanda's strange and not entirely adequate behavior in the first days after the murder. Her alleged inability to show empathy and emotions that would befit an innocent person in such a tragic situation. On the other hand, Amanda and Raphael's defense built its strategy on questioning the reliability and admissibility of the collected evidence. Lawyers argued that in the process of collecting and analyzing physical evidence, significant violations were committed that could lead to their accidental or intentional contamination. And this, accordingly, made such evidence unreliable and unsuitable for use in court. Another important argument of the defense was the unreliability of Amanda's initial testimony. Her lawyers claimed that this testimony was obtained as a result of long and exhausting interrogations conducted without the participation of a lawyer and an interpreter. Under such conditions, according to the defenders, Amanda could break down and provide false testimony that did not correspond to reality. In addition, Knox and Solicito's lawyers drew attention to the absence in the case file of a clear motive that could explain why young people who had no problems with the law suddenly decided to commit such a brutal murder. The defense insisted that the prosecution had failed to provide a convincing answer to this question. It is also important to note the role of the media in this high-profile case. The media closely followed every day of the trial, relishing the smallest details and often taking one side or the other. Some publications openly sympathized with the prosecution, portraying Amanda as a cunning and immoral person. Others, on the contrary, sympathized with the defendants and criticized the actions of the prosecutor's office and the court. Such media bias further fueled passions in society and created additional difficulties for the administration of impartial justice. Thus, the trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito turned out to be a real battlefield between the prosecution and the defense, where each side tried to present its version of events and convince the jury of its rightness. This confrontation was accompanied by active media intervention and close public attention, which only increased the tension and drama of the situation. And although at that time no one knew how this story would end, it was clear to everyone that it would not be an easy walk. This decision caused a considerable resonance both in Italy and abroad, especially in the USA, Amanda's homeland. Many Americans were shocked and outraged by this verdict, considering it unfair and biased. In the States, calls began to be made for a review of the case, and Amanda herself turned into almost a symbol of the fight against an imperfect justice system. The case gained not only wide public attention, but also a political coloring. American high-ranking officials, including then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, expressed concern about the fate of their compatriot and called on the Italian authorities to ensure a fair consideration of the appeal. Amanda Knox's story sparked heated debates in Italian society about the state of the criminal justice system, investigative methods, and the problem of the arbitrariness of law enforcement. Many were outraged by how ineptly and tendentiously the police and the prosecutor's office worked, how easily they rejected evidence that did not fit into their version, and how peremptorily they imposed their point of view. For Amanda Knox herself, this story had very serious and dramatic consequences. Even after the final acquittal, it was very difficult for the girl to return to a normal life and get rid of the stigma of a murderer. Her name will forever remain inextricably linked with this high-profile and controversial case. In order to somehow mitigate the negative consequences of what happened, Amanda wrote an autobiographical book and also actively got involved in the work of organizations that help people who have been unjustly convicted or accused of serious crimes. She seeks to draw society's attention to the problems of miscarriages of justice and investigative arbitrariness, warning that anyone can end up behind bars due to an imperfect system. One of the most striking aspects of the Amanda Knox case was the unprecedented media coverage it received. It seemed that the whole world, with bated breath, was following every twist and turn of this detective story. Particularly close attention was paid to the figure of Amanda herself, a young American woman who found herself at the epicenter of this storm. It must be admitted that the media played an extremely ambiguous role in this story. On the one hand, they performed their usual function informing the public about the course of events. But on the other hand, in pursuit of sensationalism and ratings, many media outlets openly speculated on this topic, fueling hysteria and stirring up emotions. The tabloids, both Italian and British, were especially zealous. They quickly stuck the label Foxy Knoxy on Amanda, hinting at her alleged cunning and ability to manipulate people. This image of a sexually liberated, immoral American woman was firmly entrenched in the mass consciousness and undoubtedly greatly harmed Amanda. In general, the media often exploited cliches and stereotypes, contrasting depraved American culture with traditional values of Italian society. Amanda was portrayed as the embodiment of all the vices of modern youth: selfishness, irresponsibility, promiscuity. And Italian justice, accordingly, looked like a bastion of morality and order. Of course, such pressure from the media could not but affect the atmosphere around the trial. It created additional pressure on judges and jurors, because everyone understood that millions of eyes were closely watching their every word and gesture. In such conditions, it was extremely difficult to remain impartial and objective. Public opinion on the case was divided. In Italy, many were inclined to the version of Amanda and Raphael's guilt, believing that the 2009 verdict restored justice. They say the arrogant American was quite rightly punished for a terrible crime. On the other hand, in the United States, sympathies for Amanda prevailed. Most Americans were convinced that their compatriot had become a victim of a biased and incompetent investigation, that she was convicted on the basis of circumstantial evidence and speculation. It is not surprising if the Knox case quickly acquired a political coloring. And although Amanda and Raphael were eventually acquitted, this story had serious and long-term consequences. In particular, it forced the Italian authorities to think about the need for reforms in the criminal justice system. After all, it became obvious that the current procedures for collecting and evaluating evidence are far from perfect, and the rights of suspects and accused are often violated. At the same time, the Knox case gave impetus to a discussion about ethical standards in journalism. Many experts pointed out the unacceptability of such irresponsible and biased coverage of high-profile criminal cases. After all, media pressure and whipping up hysteria seriously affect public sentiment and can push the court to make politically motivated decisions. One cannot fail to mention the cultural impact of the Amanda Knox case. Based on these events, many books were written, several documentaries and feature films were made. Each such work offered its own interpretation of what happened, placed its own accents and evaluated the characters in its own way. In general, this story left a deep mark on the collective memory and continues to influence the image of Italy, especially in terms of the impartiality and professionalism of its justice system. There is no doubt that interest in the Amanda Knox case will not fade for many years to come, because it has become the embodiment of the eternal human drama, the clash of good and evil, truth and falsehood, justice and prejudice. In December 2009, an Italian court found Amanda Knox and her then-boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito guilty of the murder of British student Meredith Kercher. Amanda was sentenced to 26 years in prison, Raffaele to 25 years. It would seem that a line had been drawn under this high-profile case. But in reality, everything was just beginning. The fact is that the verdict caused considerable indignation and protests both in Italy and abroad, especially in the United States. Many believed that the court was biased and the evidence unconvincing and contradictory. Under pressure from the public and the efforts of the defense team, a retrial was scheduled in 2010. And in 2013, what supporters of Amanda and Raffaele had been waiting for so long happened. The appellate court heeded the arguments of the defense and agreed to reconsider the key evidence in the case. In particular, independent experts were called in who seriously questioned the reliability and admissibility of some of the physical evidence presented by the prosecution. It turned out that in the collection and storage of this evidence, significant violations were committed that could lead to their accidental or deliberate contamination. That is, it could not be said with certainty that, for example, the DNA of the suspects on certain items got there precisely during the commission of the crime and not got there through the negligence of the investigators. This expert testimony was decisive. In October 2011, the appellate court overturned the conviction and declared Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito not guilty of the murder of Meredith Kercher. They were immediately released from custody, and Amanda was finally able to return home to Seattle. But even with that, the case did not end. The prosecution appealed the decision of the appellate court to the Supreme Court of Cassation of Italy, and in March 2013, this court unexpectedly overturned the acquittal and ordered a retrial. This turn of events shocked many and caused a new surge of public outrage. However, during the new appellate process in 2014, the prosecution again failed to provide compelling evidence of Amanda and Raffaele's guilt. Finally, in March 2015, the Italian Supreme Court upheld their final acquittal and closed the case. This time forever. After all these dramatic events, Amanda Knox returned to the United States and tried to start a new life. However, as you can imagine, it was very difficult for her to do this. She will forever remain a person whose name is inextricably linked with one of the loudest and most controversial trials of our time. Knox did not hide from this burden. On the contrary, she decided to use her experience and popularity to draw attention to the problems of the criminal justice system. She began to actively advocate for reforms, give interviews, and write books. Her case has become a kind of symbol of a miscarriage of justice and a call for greater caution and responsibility in the investigation and consideration of criminal cases. In general, this story left us with many lessons. It showed how important it is to strictly adhere to procedural norms when collecting and using evidence. How powerful and dangerous the influence of the media and public opinion on the course of a trial can be, and how difficult it is to correct a miscarriage of justice if it has already occurred. The Amanda Knox case will forever go down in history as an example that even the loudest and seemingly obvious accusations can sometimes turn out to be false, and that the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence must be reliably protected under any circumstances. Radical ideologies often cross the line of common sense, causing their followers to lose touch with reality. It's even worse when the victims of manipulation sincerely begin to believe in the illusions imposed on them. One example of the tragic consequences that blind faith in destructive ideas can lead to occurred in Sweden, a country that has always been considered one of the safest in the world due to its extremely low level of violent crime. In the small Swedish village of Björnberg, on July 27, 1971, a boy named Helge Fossmo was born into a family that was not particularly religious. He became one of 5 children in the family. Despite the lack of religious upbringing, At the age of 12, Helgi independently became interested in the church and joined a local youth religious group, becoming one of its most active participants. Although his parents did not share their son's enthusiasm, they did not hinder him, believing that it was not the worst occupation for a teenager. According to Helge himself, it was from the moment he joined the church community that his life acquired true meaning, and he found a kind of salvation in faith. For the next 5 years, the young man completely devoted himself to religion, constantly attending church services and participating in various church events. In 1988, fate led Helge to a cafe for Christian youth, where he met his future wife, Helen Johansson. The young couple got married as soon as they came of age and settled in the town of Bordenberg. The couple had 2 children, and Helgi continued to delve into religious issues, becoming a preacher in the local community. However, in 1993, a fateful meeting took place that radically changed the life of Helgi and his family. The man met Asa Waldau, a charismatic leader of a Christian sect known as the Bride of Christ. Asa came from the tiny town of Knutby, where her teachings originated, with the intention of opening a branch of her church in Bordenberg. Knutby is such a small settlement with a population of about 700 people that there is only one store, one restaurant, a church, and a few dozen wooden houses scattered among the forest. It would seem that in such a cozy corner, there is no place for evil. But it was here at that time that people lived who later committed 3 horrific murders that overshadowed the crimes of many serial killers in their scale and cruelty. Asa traveled from town to town, preaching her teachings and recruiting new followers, especially among young people. She masterfully manipulated people's minds, urging them to give up everything worldly and devote their lives to serving her church. Helga's family turned out to be an ideal target for the ambitious Bride of Christ. Helga's first meeting with Asa did not go quite smoothly. The devoted Christian expressed doubts that a woman could be a pastor. However, thanks to her remarkable manipulative abilities, Asa managed to convince the Fosmo family to join her sect, not suspecting what tragic and irreversible consequences this would lead to. Skeptical of Asa's radical views and methods, especially after realizing her affiliation with a sect, Helgi initially rejected the idea of joining the Bride of Christ community. However, the ambitious preacher did not give up. She was interested in attracting the young Fosmo couple to her ranks, so she acted cautiously and methodically. Over the next 4 years, Asa gradually gained the trust of Helgi and Helen, convincing them of the safety of her church's activities. At the same time, she promoted her own teachings, which increasingly captivated Helgi. Eventually, in 1997, the couple agreed not only to join Asa's community, but also to move to the town of Knutby, where her church was located. At first, the move was presented as an ordinary, friendly visit. Asa showed the young family her church from the inside, told them about its activities and goals. Gradually, she increasingly gained the attention of her new followers, criticizing the shortcomings of the traditional church, which eventually sowed a seed of doubt in Helga's mind. A significant part of the residents of Knutby already belonged to Asa's religious community and were involved in various areas of the church's activities. The organization provided work for everyone who wanted it, and almost every member of the community had their own responsibilities, often related to religious service. This brought people together who knew each other well, supported and protected their own. The community gladly accepted the new preacher Helge and his family into their ranks. Having become a pastor of the church in Knutby, Helge quickly drew attention to himself with unconventional motives in his sermons. He often spoke on taboo topics such as sex and death, interpreting them rather dubiously. Despite the fact that not all parishioners shared the radical approach to the interpretation of Scripture, Helge relentlessly pursued his mission. 2 years after the move, the Fosmo family had their 3rd child, which increased the burden on the parents. They decided to hire a nanny, Sarah Svensson, who had recently moved to Knutby, inspired by Asa's teachings. Sarah had grown up in a deeply religious Christian family, but from childhood suffered from severe allergies, which limited her life. The girl was cared for by her mother, with whom she had a very close relationship. But at the age of 11, Sarah lost her mother due to a long illness. This event devastated the girl, turning her into a troubled teenager who often ran away from home. After his wife's death, the entire burden of raising his daughter fell on the father. Despite all his efforts, the man could not fully replace Sarah's mother, although they also had a close bond. The girl stayed with her father until she accidentally met Asa during her travels around the cities in search of new followers. Their acquaintance took place at Bible courses and quickly grew into a close friendship. Sarah turned out to be an ideal candidate for recruitment into the sect. For the experienced manipulator Asa, it was not difficult to discern the girl's vulnerable spots and skillfully use them to lure her into her community. Eventually, Sarah decided to move to Knutby to be closer to the church and comprehend the ways that Asa preached. During this period, Helgi became closer to Asa than ever before. They spent a lot of time together, not only delving into the study of Scripture. This couple claimed to receive divine messages, which they interpreted as prophecies. Helgi diligently wrote down these revelations in his diary, describing in detail the visions, sensations, and their interpretation. One of these records stated that God named Helgi the King of Kings and Asa the Queen of Heaven. According to the pastor, he appeared in the world even at the time of the creation of the world, and since then had been waiting for a meeting with an equal being, Asa. The woman, in turn, insisted that she should marry Helgi, because their union would elevate the alternative religion to an incredible height. Both unreservedly believed in these ideas. In 1999, they arranged a kind of sacrament, the wedding ceremony of Helgi and Asa. The man gave her a ring with 7 diamonds, because this number has a sacred meaning in many faiths. And all this despite the fact that Helen was still the official wife of the pastor. Of course, such a course of events caused unbearable jealousy on the part of Helen, which led to a rift in her relationship with her husband. Then Asa intervened. She criticized the young wife for jealousy, calling this feeling the most shameful for a true Christian. The sect leader insisted that Helen should change her attitude, otherwise the community would find a way to create serious problems for her, in particular, to take away the house. The intimidated woman was forced to come to terms. The relationship between Helgi and Asa took on an increasingly strange hue. Despite the fact that the pastor was still officially married, he hardly engaged with his family, spending all his time with Asa. This became especially noticeable after their sacrament. The woman constantly showered him with love and praise, attaching him to herself more and more. Asa skillfully used Helgi's devotion not to build a strong relationship or even to separate him from his wife. Her only goal was to establish complete control over the man. Acting insidiously and effectively, she quickly achieved her goal. Helgi found himself completely dependent on her. Asa knew everything about him, and sex, which they constantly engaged in, became the most powerful weapon of manipulation. At the same time, the sect leader convinced the pastor that he could literally embody Jesus. All these absurd ideas multiplied like a snowball, and the behavior of Helgi and Asa became more and more outrageous and abnormal. Neither Helen, nor the children, nor other members of the community could influence this situation. Given Asa's manipulative nature, tensions in the Knutby community grew steadily, portending inevitable tragedy. In December 1999, the town was gripped by an epidemic of illness, which did not spare the Fossmo couple. Confined to bed by illness, Helga and Helen were forced to transfer most of the household chores to nanny and housekeeper Sarah Svensson, who miraculously escaped infection. On the morning of December 18th, despite feeling unwell, the couple had breakfast together, after which an exhausted Helgi decided to lie down to rest. Having fallen fast asleep, the man heard a knock at the door through his dream. Upon waking up, he found that his wife was nowhere to be found. It turned out that a concerned neighbor had come to their house, who had not heard any news from the couple all day. Helge assured the neighbor that everything was fine, but he insisted on seeing Helen. The woman did not respond to loud calls, although she definitely had to be at home. Remembering that his wife was going to take a shower, Helgi became worried about her long absence. The men decided to check what had happened. Since Helen did not respond to her name, they had to break the lock with a screwdriver. In the overflowing bathtub, they found the lifeless body of a woman floating face down. The door was locked from the inside, and Helen was still wearing the nightgown she had worn at breakfast. Helgi's eerie scream attracted the attention of several neighbors who ran to the house. Together, they pulled the body out of the water and tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it was too late. 27-year-old Helen was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed that the deceased woman had a serious head injury that could well have been fatal. The forensic expert suggested several possible causes of death. Obviously, the resulting traumatic brain injury could lead to loss of consciousness and, as a result, drowning of the young mother. Even more questions were raised by the results of a toxicological examination, which revealed an extremely high dose of opioids in the victim's blood. According to calculations, this amount of drugs would be enough to kill Helen, but the woman never took any drugs. Despite all the signs of a possible murder, law enforcement officers classified this case as an accident. They concluded that Helen slipped, fell, and hit her head on the faucet. Sarah Svensson's testimony played an important role in this, confirming every word of the pastor that his wife was alone in the bathroom and no one could kill her. Helgi appeared grief-stricken and sincerely saddened by the loss of his beloved wife. However, those who knew him more closely noticed some strange changes in the behavior of the widower. In particular, he almost immediately got rid of all the things associated with Helen and never mentioned her again, even forbidding the children to talk about their mother. Some suspected that Helen's death was not an accident, but that the unwanted wife was simply gotten rid of so that she would not interfere with ambitious plans. In addition, it became known that the man personally influenced the conclusion of the forensic medical examination. At first, Helgi, citing religious beliefs, demanded that an autopsy not be performed at all, but he was refused due to the suspicious circumstances of the death. Then the preacher insisted on removing information about the presence of opioids in the blood of the deceased from the conclusion. He explained his demand by the desire to minimize the likelihood that his wife could have committed suicide, because it is a sin because of which her soul will not go to heaven. With these dubious actions, Helgi allegedly sought to protect Helen's memory and the reputation of his family from shame. Suddenly, during this period, Asa lost interest in Helga. Their stormy romance was cut short when she once again went on a pilgrimage and decided not to return. Unfortunately, the charismatic leader managed to thoroughly brainwash the pastor, who was filled with determination to continue on the path of the sect. Despite the ostentatious grief and tears, Helgi very quickly found a new love in the person of Asa's sister, Alexandra Waldau. The relationship between the lovers developed rapidly, greatly facilitated by Helga's high status. At that time, many considered him a person close to God, so they treated him with great respect, which also bribed Alexandra. Already in the spring of 2000, she moved into the pastor's house and soon they got married. However, even a new marriage did not curb Helga's sexual appetites. One woman was always not enough for him, so already in the spring of 2001, he began to actively court the nanny of his children, Sarah Svensson, who still worked in his house. The girl readily accepted signs of attention from such a respected man. Their relationship even received a blessing from the sect leader Asa Waldau. By the time these events unfolded, Helga's relationship with Alexandra had deteriorated. Nanny Sarah, who became the pastor's lover, tried to support him in solving family problems. Helgi cynically took advantage of the girl's sympathy, often inviting her to pray together in the church. During these prayer meetings, the man often inclined Sarah to intimacy, insisting that this had nothing to do with satisfying carnal desires, but was a kind of spiritual union and a message to God. So strong was Sarah's belief in Helga's righteousness that she willingly believed these stories and even felt some kind of divine inspiration at such moments. The girl sincerely believed that she was doing a godly deed.
although in fact she fell into the trap of a skilled manipulator who covered himself with spiritual values, having goals far from religion. Shortly after the beginning of this relationship, Helgi began to voice increasingly contradictory statements. At first, he declared that the Lord was waging his battles on earth, and the pastor himself was his warrior. According to Helgi, this mission was not easy, because sometimes it was necessary to remove various obstacles along the way. The man spoke in riddles, and the naive Sarah, who perceived her lover's sermons as divine revelations, willingly believed everything. In fact, Helgi was gradually probing the ground for the implementation of his insidious plan. Later, the pastor began to tell that during sex, God sends him important messages about the fate of his second wife, Alexandra. Helgi interpreted these signs as a portent of her imminent death. Brainwashing Sarah, he claimed that the Lord had shown him the ideal life companion, herself, the nanny. Moreover, Helgi intimidated the girl by saying that he himself could die if his marriage to Alexandra was not dissolved. Although during this period their union was falling apart at the seams, the pastor could not get a divorce due to strict church rules. Like all the women in Helga's entourage, Sarah was enchanted by his stories. With these bizarre messages, he gradually led the nanny of his children to commit a terrible act. The skilled manipulator managed to firmly tie the victim to himself, using his authority in the church and knowledge of Sarah's vulnerabilities. Helgi adopted many techniques of such control from Asa, and now willingly put them into practice. At that time, many people seriously considered the pastor to be the person closest to God, so it was not difficult for him to persuade the nanny to his side. According to Helgi, the girl had to help the Almighty in the battle with demons, for which she needed to move in with him, despite the fact that he was still living with Alexandra. The women lived in different rooms, and Helga had sex with both of them every night in turn, each time justifying it as a fight against evil spirits. The pastor called intimate relationships a ritual of purification from defilement. His eloquence allowed him to convince his mistresses that he was a messenger of heaven, and in this way opposed the enemies of the Lord. These peculiar three-way relationships lasted until 2003, although Helgi already wanted to get rid of Alexandra, with whom he allegedly broke up, but could not officially divorce. During this period, the manipulation of Sarah reached its apogee. For the most part, Helgi turned to her only for sex, and the rest of the time he insulted her, calling her a sinner and an arrogant blonde. But each time he ended the emotional torture with the phrase, "I love you." The girl was so happy with these three words that she stopped paying attention to all the insults. She was willing to do anything to earn the favor of the chosen one of God, a fighter against demons, not even noticing how, along with this, she was losing her own will, turning into a puppet in the hands of a dangerous man. Against the backdrop of problems with his second wife, Helgi repeatedly asked his mistress if she was ready to kill in the name of the Lord. If earlier Sarah hesitated with the answer, now, it seemed, she reacted more calmly, and the pastor felt that he would soon be able to persuade her to do it. The girl replied that she was not ready, but resisted much weaker than before. Then, to push Sarah on the true path, Helgi created a new account in the Messenger and began sending her messages from an unknown number, trying to convince her that it was God himself who wanted to contact her. In these creepy correspondences, the girl was told that she had little time left and she had to kill in the name of the Lord no later than November 25th. When Sarah suspected that Helga was behind these messages, he angrily denied his involvement, once again shaming his mistress, accusing her of a lack of faith and sinfulness. Unfortunately, it worked as it had before. Afterward, the pastor began sending Sarah messages that she should become part of the divine plan, sending human souls to heaven. This alleged God claimed that for her, this was the only way to salvation. Helga's manipulations and intimidation led Sarah to begin to fear for her soul and dare to commit a crime. On November 8, 2003, she broke into the pastor's house and attacked his wife Alexandra, who was sleeping in her bed. Sarah hit her with a hammer,
but the woman miraculously managed to survive and fight off the attacker. The reason for the attack was a message that Sarah allegedly received from God via messenger. It contained an order to immediately kill the preacher's wife. Oddly enough, the criminal escaped punishment, probably due to Helga's insistence not to report the incident to the police. Indeed, no record of this event was found in the law enforcement database. Instead of punishment, the pastor expelled his former mistress to live with her own father. However, this did not affect Sarah's correspondence with God in any way, which only fueled her terrifying confidence in the need to kill. Shortly after these events, Helga found a new passion, a neighbor, Annette Lind, who at that time was married to a man named Daniel. Having decided to get rid of a competitor, the preacher began sending messages to Sarah, manipulating her in the same way as before. The frightened girl, seeking salvation, again agreed to take up arms. This time, Sarah prepared more thoroughly. She bought a pistol and even researched on the internet how to make a homemade silencer. Following the instructions of the Almighty, she hoped for success and the liberation of her soul. On January 10, 2004, at 3:30 in the morning, Sarah, keeping in touch with Helga, drove up in her father's car to the area where the pastor lived. Having parked 500 meters from the house, the killer put on a black mask and put on shoes of different sizes to throw the police off the trail. Entering through the unlocked door, the lock of which the organizer of the crime broke in advance, staging a robbery, Sarah crept into the room of 23-year-old Alexandra, who was sleeping soundly. Having shot first in the thigh and then, when the victim woke up and screamed, in the head, the criminal killed the woman. At 4:30 in the morning, Sarah went to the house of the second victim, Daniel, the husband of Helga's new mistress. The pastor knew that the man was left alone that night and told Sarah about it. The doors were locked, so the girl just knocked. When 30-year-old Daniel opened the door, she shot him in the chest without hesitation, and when he fell, once more in the head. Fleeing from the crime scene, Sarah did not suspect that the second victim had survived. Daniel managed to get to the phone and call for help. Arriving at the call, the police found him conscious, so he was able to describe the attacker. At that moment, 32-year-old Helgi was already at the crime scene, allegedly trying to help his neighbor. Helgi accompanied the wounded Daniel to the hospital, where he learned about the murder of his wife Alexandra. The pastor again began to play the role of a grief-stricken husband. The description of the attacker provided by Daniel was rather confusing due to the mask on her face. Gradually, attention focused on Helgi and Sarah. One of the neighbors, whose brains had not yet been washed, recalled similar strange circumstances of the death of the pastor's first wife. Information also surfaced about the hammer attack on Alexandra, during which she nearly died at the hands of Sarah. The bloody fingerprints found at the scene of Alexandra's murder and on the door of Daniel's house became irrefutable proof of the 26-year-old nanny's guilt. Sarah was immediately arrested. At first, she insisted that she acted independently, without anyone's prompting, and then began to claim that she committed crimes in the name of God. During a search of Sarah, a phone was seized, where Helga's number and another unknown subscriber were found. Although no correspondence with the Almighty was found on this device, the detectives came across a call from Sarah's old number. Thorough searches of her house revealed another mobile phone, which stored more than 1,000 text messages with God. These messages contained intrusive manipulation and incitement to murder. After tracking the unknown number, the investigation led to the pastor of the local church. Learning about this, the disappointed Sarah, who sincerely believed in the divine origin of the correspondence, told the police the whole truth. The wounded Daniel's wife, Annette Lind, was also suspected of complicity and arrested, but 2 weeks later, she was released without charge. During the trial, the arrogant Helge denied his involvement and showed no remorse. A psychiatric examination found him sane. The scale of the manipulations was staggering. Having sufficient evidence, the prosecutor's office proved Helge's guilt in inciting the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life. In July 2004, the pastor was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 24 years. Despite several appeals that were rejected, Helgi will only have a chance for early release in 2028. He was also accused of involvement in the death of his first wife, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence, although the prosecutor is convinced of his guilt. In 2007, while in prison, Helgi married for the third time. The identity of his new wife remains unknown. During an interview in August 2006, the imprisoned pastor admitted his involvement in the murder of Alexandra and the attack on Daniel, claiming that several other people were involved in organizing the crimes. However, the case was never reopened. Currently, Helge Fossmo is serving his sentence in the maximum security prison Tidaholm in Sweden. At the trial, a video was shown with a reconstruction of the crime, where Sarah spoke in detail about what she had done. A private investigation revealed that the court was shown an edited version, while the original 6-hour recording contained discrepancies with the actual details of the crime. In interviews with journalists, Sarah adhered to the false reconstruction of events. This raised doubts about the true course of events and the identity of the main culprit. It was assumed that the murderer could be the pastor himself, who shifted the responsibility to Sarah. Sarah Svensson, recognized as insane, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. In 2011, after completing treatment, she was released, as doctors considered her safe for society. In 2020, sect leader Asa Waldau was convicted on 8 counts of assaulting former parishioners and sentenced to community service. The woman changed her last name, moved, and withdrew from church affairs. Thanks to the efforts of doctors, Daniel survived the attack but refused to return to the city, fearing the local church and sectarians. Another pastor of the same church, Urban Feld, was convicted of sexual exploitation of persons dependent on him. Several women from the community whom he called his daughters and manipulated. The moral of this chilling story is that blind faith and fanaticism can lead to terrible consequences, especially when manipulated by ruthless and charismatic individuals. The tragedy in Knutby demonstrates how religious beliefs, taken to extremes, can cloud the mind and push people to the most terrible acts. The main tragedy of this story was not only the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life, but also the ruined lives of all those who fell under the pernicious influence of Pastor Helge Fossmo. Sarah Svensson suffered the most, a young girl who, due to naivety and gullibility, became a toy in the hands of an experienced manipulator. Her sincere faith was cynically used to achieve selfish goals, which led to irreparable consequences. To protect yourself from such situations, it is necessary to always maintain critical thinking and not allow anyone to manipulate your consciousness, even if it is a spiritual leader. You cannot blindly trust authorities and follow instructions that are contrary to morality and common sense. Faith should be a conscious choice, not an instrument of control in the hands of other people. It is important to remember that true religion brings love, mercy, and forgiveness, not hatred, condemnation, and violence. Some crimes remain unsolved for years, even decades. Case files gather dust in police archives while the perpetrators continue living their lives, starting families and enjoying freedom, a privilege their victims are deprived of. Today, I'll tell you about a killer who managed to evade justice for over a decade and a half. But even he ultimately faced retribution. Rebecca Good was born on April 28, 1982 in the small town of Melbourne, Kansas, USA. With a population of barely 2,000 people, she was one of 4 daughters in the family. When the children were still very young, their parents decided to divorce. The process proved extremely unpleasant for all family members. The father made every effort to gain custody of his daughters, but the court sided with the mother. Despite the difficulties in separation, all the sisters maintained a relationship with their father. They were very close to each other and always took care of one another. As a teenager, Rebecca enrolled in a community college in Arkansas. To live closer to her place of study, she moved to the largest city of Fayetteville, with a population of around 100,000. Here, the girl pursued her education, worked part-time jobs, and prepared to enter university. Rebecca settled into an apartment with her younger sister Danielle, who was also her best friend. A couple weeks after moving,
the sisters returned to their hometown of Melbourne to spend time with family and friends. 22-year-old Rebecca, after visiting with relatives, drove Danielle to her boyfriend's house and then went to see her own boyfriend Casey. At that point, they had been dating for about a year. Casey lived in a trailer located on his parents' property. They all had a wonderful weekend together. And then, little by little, they began getting ready to return to their usual work routines. On the morning of Monday, September 20, 2004, Rebecca drove her boyfriend to his job at a fast food restaurant. After that, the girl was seen buying breakfast. Rebecca stopped by a store where she ordered coffee and a sandwich. She planned to pack her things to head back home, where she and her sister were studying. Returning to her boyfriend's trailer, the girl decided to take a little nap, feeling exhausted after an almost sleepless night. Around noon, Rebecca was supposed to pick up Danielle from her boyfriend's place, but the younger sister waited in vain for the older one. The girl assumed Rebecca's plans had changed, so by evening she made her own way to their parents' house. There she gathered some things for the trip and went to bed. The next morning, Danielle hoped to meet her older sister, but she never returned. The girl called Casey, but he hadn't spent the night at home and knew nothing about his girlfriend's whereabouts. The young man was certain Rebecca was long home by now. Other friends and acquaintances also denied seeing her. Hoping to find out if something had happened to her sister, Danielle called the sheriff's department. She reported that the girl had gone missing a little less than 24 hours ago. The police were immediately interested in what happened. Investigators began working through possible scenarios, gathering information from the reporting party. After talking to her, they decided to speak with the last person who saw Rebecca before she disappeared. The police went to Casey's workplace, the missing girl's boyfriend, since he was the last one to see Rebecca. However, the young man told law enforcement that the night before he had stayed at a friend's house, and in the morning he went straight to work. He knew the girl was supposed to leave with her sister and wasn't expecting her to return. But the detectives were alarmed by Casey's decision, especially considering he had a dog that needed care. The young man couldn't leave it for long, although there was someone on his parents' property to look after the animal. The police had no evidence to confirm their suspicions, but investigators still decided to inspect the trailer where the missing girl's boyfriend lived. They requested his consent to search. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed Rebecca's car parked nearby. Inside the trailer, there was a sharp smell of bleach. All the missing girl's things were in place. Her purse, money, cell phone, even the breakfast she bought, the coffee and sandwich, remained untouched. It seemed as if the student hadn't gone anywhere at all. Even her dog, a Pomeranian, was there, which she definitely couldn't have left unattended for long. In the bedroom, the police noticed the heavily crumpled bedding. The duvet was found in the washing machine with traces of blood. A bottle of bleach stood by the bed. Detectives looked under the mattress and saw large fresh red stains on it. Obviously, someone had recently flipped it over, trying to hide these traces. After this discovery, law enforcement's suspicions only strengthened. An examination showed that the blood on the mattress and bedding belonged to the missing girl. Casey became the main suspect in Rebecca's disappearance and probable murder, given the amount of blood found in his trailer. However, several colleagues and the young man's management confirmed that on the day of the disappearance, at 8 a.m., the girl had dropped him off at work. She was whole and unharmed, after which she went about her business and didn't return. The young man worked until 4:30 p.m., and when his shift ended, friends picked him up in a car. This was seen by several witnesses. Casey went to the movies with his buddies for an evening showing, and then they headed straight to one of the friends' houses. The tired young man went to bed and didn't get up until the morning of September 21. From there, he went directly to the fast food restaurant. The friend also confirmed Casey's alibi. It seemed the young man had solid proof of his non-involvement, so there were no grounds for arrest. But investigators still didn't completely rule him out as a suspect. They continued carefully examining the crime scene. All the girl's things remained in the trailer, with the exception of the suitcase she usually took with her on trips. Police suspected that the body could have been hidden in it. Another interesting detail was the absence of one of the legs of the piano that stood in the trailer. According to Casey, this leg had long been loose and would fall off if you bumped the instrument, but he didn't know where it had gone. Maybe it rolled somewhere. Among the versions regarding Rebecca's disappearance, the possibility of her running off with her ex-boyfriend Justin was also considered. The police contacted him, but the young man assured that he had not seen the missing girl and had not maintained any relationship with her for a long time. Meanwhile, the search for Rebecca continued,
and a week later, law enforcement received alarming news. On September 27, 2004, the body of the 22-year-old student was found in a ravine near the road. A random witness came across a pit formed by a mound, at the bottom of which lay the dead girl. The victim of the brutal attack was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Rebecca had died about a week ago. This meant that it was on Monday, September 20, after she dropped her boyfriend off at work, that an unknown criminal attacked and killed her. The girl received 2 separate blows to the head with a blunt object. The first broke her nose, and the second was fatal, fracturing her skull. Numerous bruises were found on Rebecca's body, indicating a brutal beating. Interestingly, the shape of the injuries matched the mark that could have been left by the broken leg of the piano, which was not found in Casey's trailer. It was considered the murder weapon, but this piece of evidence could not be found next to the body. The medical examiner found no signs of resistance, so the girl apparently did not expect the attack. So the attack on her was committed by someone she knew, or she was attacked from behind. There were also no signs of sexual assault, so that was not the motive for the crime. Among Rebecca's injuries, a fracture of the hyoid bone was recorded, indicating prolonged and forceful strangulation. After the body was discovered, law enforcement again turned their attention to Casey. Witnesses reported that the girl had long wanted to break up with him, considering the young man to be the main cause of problems in the relationship. His possessive attitudes provoked most of the conflicts, which only intensified after Rebecca moved to another city to study. However, Casey had a reliable alibi. Nevertheless, detectives and many local residents were convinced that he was guilty of the brutal attack, since the murder took place in his house. Investigators desperately tried to link Casey to this tragedy, so they carefully checked all the information about him. But at every stage, the young man had confirmation of his alibi. He was seen by colleagues at work. Benny spent time with friends. There were tickets and payment receipts left. The next morning, Casey showed up at work again and spent the whole day there. His alibi ruled out the possibility of him committing any criminal acts against Rebecca, with whom he couldn't even have crossed paths, unless he slipped away from work unnoticed, but detectives considered that probability too low. Casey worked in a fast food restaurant, constantly in plain sight, so his absence would have been noticed immediately. It was assumed that the girl could have been attacked not on Monday morning, but on Sunday evening, when the young man had no alibi. But here too a contradiction arose. Eyewitnesses claimed that it was Rebecca who brought her boyfriend to work in her car on Monday morning. Moreover, she then stopped by the store to buy breakfast, where she was also seen. The salesman remembered the girl buying a sandwich and a donut, which were later found in her boyfriend's trailer. This confirmed that the employee was not mistaken. So the version about the attack on Sunday had to be quickly discarded. Everything indicated that Rebecca returned to the trailer, and it was there or somewhere nearby that she was attacked. After all her things remained inside, but no signs of a break-in were found in the dwelling, which meant that the girl most likely opened the door herself to someone she knew, or the door wasn't locked at all. Of course, after Casey, other members of his family who lived on the property where the trailer stood fell under suspicion. They all could have communicated and seen the girl, in fact had free access to the young man's home. But it turned out that the father of the family was out of town during that period. He worked as a truck driver and was on an intercity route. Casey's siblings also provided alibis that were quickly confirmed. It turned out that none of his relatives living on the property could have attacked the girl. Meanwhile, the police continued to communicate with the main suspect, Casey, trying to find out new details about the last days of Rebecca's life. The young man admitted that on Sunday evening he saw his cousin, 27-year-old William Miller. He was passing by and stopped for a few minutes at the driveway to talk. Although the visit was brief, investigators latched onto this information. Everything indicated that the victim knew her killer, and it could have been anyone. It became known that William had come to town to help his mother move back from Texas. He arrived that same evening and was in the city during the period of the girl's disappearance, which looked suspicious. Could William have had a motive for committing the crime? To get more information, detectives spoke with him, but couldn't find out anything new. He only confirmed talking to his cousin on Sunday evening, after which he left without seeing Rebecca. Another suspect was a girl named Jenny Fertner, who had long been at odds with Rebecca over her ex-boyfriend Justin. But this time, too, the police failed to find evidence of her involvement in the attack. At the time of the murder, she had a reliable alibi. Gathering information about the last days of the deceased's life, detectives learned that she had met with a guy named J.B. Etsy. There was no romantic relationship between them, but the young man sold her marijuana, for which she owed him $20. Investigators thought he might well have been involved in the murder over money. But during the conversation with him, nothing suspicious was found. The guy claimed that he would never have killed a young girl, even for an amount many times greater than the $20 debt. He successfully passed a polygraph test, so he was released. Another person investigators spoke to was Chris Cantrell. There were several witnesses who claimed he had bragged about an attack on a young student. Of course, the detectives were immediately interested in him. But during interrogation at the police station, Chris denied these claims, and the witnesses with their contradictory statements could not be found. After checking this man, he was released for lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. After this episode, the investigation reached a dead end. Despite public anxiety and pressure from the victim's relatives, the process stalled and did not move forward for several years. During this time, Rebecca's parents constantly reminded about themselves, repeatedly asking for police documents on the case. But they were refused. Eventually, the parents hired a private detective, hoping he could shed light on the circumstances of their daughter's tragic death. But even the professional failed to uncover new details of the bloody attack. Rebecca's relatives even announced a $25,000 reward for information that would help find the killer. But even this did not move the investigation from a dead end. Only in the late 2010s did the case unexpectedly receive a new impetus. Several podcasts covered the girl's brutal murder, drawing public attention to the unsolved crime. In 2018, another episode dedicated to Rebecca's death was released. The host, who was originally from the area, invited the deceased's relatives and friends to talk. They shared their versions of what could have happened. During the interview, one of the witnesses provided shocking information. He personally heard Casey bragging about killing Rebecca. According to this person, they worked together, and one time, when the young man got drunk, he confessed to the deed. But the credibility of this testimony was in doubt. First, Casey's confession allegedly took place 8 years ago, when he was intoxicated. Moreover, the witness was also under the influence. And despite all this, for some reason he did not report what he heard to the police. It's quite possible that his story for the podcast was just an attempt to attract attention to himself, to get publicity. In addition, it turned out that this witness's wife had an affair with Casey, so the man could just be looking for a way to get back at his rival. However, even this dubious information forced detectives to return to the investigation and take up the case with renewed vigor. In 2020, a new special agent with the Arkansas State Police was ordered to reopen the investigation into Rebecca's murder. He decided to start from scratch. First of all, he interrogated everyone who could have been involved in the crime. During numerous conversations, the investigator only confirmed the old alibis, and suddenly it turned out that the only person who was in Casey's trailer shortly before Rebecca's death and had no alibi was his cousin William Miller. The police had spoken to him back in 2004, but at the time he denied any involvement in the murder. Since then, William had been completely forgotten about, but it turned out that over the years he had divorced his wife and moved to the Philippines. There he got into a relationship with another woman, with whom he started a new family and had 2 children. In the Philippines, William owned a large farm of about 12 hectares, where the family raised livestock and tended plantations that provided them with a livelihood. The couple's older son spoke English quite well, while the younger daughter knew only a few phrases, preferring the local Bisaya language. William himself worked in the oil industry and taught at the School of Equatorial Hygiene. The police suspected that his life abroad was actually related to an attempt to avoid paying taxes. After all, although he was an employee of a North American company, being outside the United States, he did not have to pay taxes. So William constantly shuttled between the Philippines, West Africa, and the United States. He visited his homeland to see relatives, get treatment, and periodically appeared at the office of the oil company he worked for. In any case, the new investigator who took over the investigation was eager to talk to this suspicious man. Unfortunately, due to his constant traveling, it was not easy to contact him. The detective had to be patient and wait for William's return. Intuition told him that Casey's cousin might know more about the brutal attack of 2004 than he had told at the time. Back in 2019, several journalists created a social media group dedicated to this unsolved crime. Interestingly, William joined it quite quickly. Of course, he had no idea that he was under the close attention of the police, because the details of the reopened investigation were kept secret. William's name did not appear in any of the podcasts, and no one outside considered him a suspect. He was a little-known member of Casey's family, with whom few people communicated closely. Therefore, this person was simply forgotten about, but for detectives, he had long been on the list of potential criminals. On the day of the murder, William had been in town for several days, helping his mother move, and in fact had access to Casey's trailer. It was this fact that caught the attention of the new investigator, and also the fact that shortly after the crime, the suspect left the country, which also looked strange. When William joined the social media group, he immediately aroused the interest of other members. The fact is that all the subscribers knew each other, had their own close-knit community, and then suddenly a man who lived so far away in the Philippines and could hardly know anything about this case joined, so his excessive interest seemed suspicious. At the same time, William demonstrated a surprisingly good knowledge of the circumstances of the murder, was literally obsessed with this topic, time after time commenting on the details of the student's death, sending newspaper clippings and eyewitness accounts that other group members did not have access to and which had not yet been made public. Community subscribers claimed that William talked about the place where the girl's body was found and also shared his suspicions that Casey's neighbors were involved in the crime. This greatly alarmed the other members of the group. One of the girls, who was well versed in genealogy, analyzed the information and found that William was the cousin of the deceased's boyfriend. This discovery caused alarm in everyone. After considering the situation, the community members decided to pass the collected information to the Arkansas State Police. Law enforcement officials were interested in this information. William's behavior his joining the group, his obsessive discussion of the murder theme resembled the actions of a criminal who monitors the progress of the investigation and tries to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But the police's hands were tied because the suspect was in another country and there was no way to interrogate him. Although there was an extradition agreement between the USA and the Philippines, more compelling grounds were needed to extradite a person. All that remained was to wait for William to return to the States on his own. In order not to miss his arrival, law enforcement officials warned the customs services. The man's passport was entered into the appropriate database. It was assumed that the system would automatically report his appearance at the border, and then customs officers would quickly contact the police. And so it happened. In October 2020, William flew to Arkansas to visit his family, who now lived there. The detective learned of his arrival. When police called the suspect's mother, she assured that her son had not appeared in the country for over a year. But this was a lie because law enforcement officials already knew that he had crossed the US border. Later, the woman explained her insincerity by the fact that she did not believe in the conversation with the police and thought that some ill wishes of William were trying to find him. Eventually, the police managed to arrange a meeting with William at the station on November 7, which he attended. Finding himself in the interrogation room, the suspect immediately declared his readiness to cooperate and provide any information necessary for the investigation. He assured that he had nothing to hide. Despite the fact that the man was suspected of murder, the detectives initially decided not to focus on this. The conversation began casually, from afar, with innocent questions in order to win over the suspect and give him the opportunity to open up. At first, the investigators were interested in William's current life and his frequent moves. He talked about his busy schedule and life, gradually relaxing. Further, the detectives showed interest in his work, place of residence and daily routine at the time of Rebecca's murder. William reported that he was then working on a 7-on-7-off schedule, that is, a week of 10-12 hours a day, and then the same amount of rest. Shortly before the tragic death of the student, his mother moved from Arkansas to Texas, and he helped her with the move. But she did not like the new state, so the woman decided to return back. William used one of his weeks off to help his mother return home. That is why he found himself in the city during the period when Rebecca Good was murdered. The police gradually approached the most important questions. It turned out that William was not very close to his cousins, although they occasionally met and communicated. According to him, he had been to his cousin's trailer only a few times, but did not remember this happening in 2004. Then the police tried to clarify the circumstances of William's meeting with Casey in September 2004. He confirmed that he did visit him while living in the house with his mother. According to the suspect, he had little communication with his cousin because he was constantly working. William saw him and the girl only in the evening, and it seemed to him as if they had some kind of quarrel. However, this aroused even more suspicion, because the young people's loved ones claimed that they did not quarrel that evening. William said that he had been to his cousin's trailer several times, but did not mention to the police about communicating with him on September 19. the day before Rebecca's death. He kept silent about this until the very end, and the detectives also did not tell him about their awareness. They tried to lead the suspect to a confession. According to William, he arrived in Kansas only on the evening of Sunday, September 19, when it was already getting dark, and stayed with his mother. In the morning, they took his younger brother to school together, and then spent the whole day packing things. On Tuesday, William rented several trucks for the move. It was during this period that police officers who came to search began working around his cousin's trailer. But he never mentioned seeing Casey and Rebecca. After that, the detectives told about their awareness of the communication between Casey and William on September 19, 2004. However, the suspect began to deny that he did not remember exactly and suggested that this meeting took place at a different time. The detectives continued to maintain a relaxed atmosphere and asked the man to provide DNA samples. He immediately refused, explaining that his DNA could have remained on the furniture items during his cousin's visit. The detectives explained to William that they would compare the DNA not with samples from the furniture, but with specific physical evidence from the crime scene. But they still could not convince him. In fact, no DNA of the killer was found at the crime scene, so the detectives just wanted to check his reaction. At the same time, the suspect agreed to take a polygraph test. Before the test began, he was clearly nervous. William claimed that he was taking medications that affected his blood pressure, so he was afraid of the low accuracy of the results. However, in reality, such problems do not affect the effectiveness of the test, which he was informed about. The polygraph examiner managed to calm the suspect down, but this did not help him successfully pass the test. William failed the polygraph, which automatically increased the police's suspicions. The interrogation continued. The investigators were determined to break the suspect. To do this, they used the same tactic that they used on Casey in the first year after the girl's murder. Then they photographed his car and tried to convince the young man that Rebecca's blood was found on the gas pedal. Of course, this was a trick to get the criminal to give himself away, but it didn't work with Casey. He continued to argue that it was possible, so the police assumed that the young man was indeed innocent. To pull the same thing on William, they had to track down and photograph his old pickup truck, which he owned at the time of the crime. When the police played the same trick, informing him that Rebecca's blood was found on the pedal of his car, it worked. The man suddenly began to stutter, get confused in his testimony. He was even more nervous, and his story instantly changed. As soon as the suspect believed that Rebecca's blood was found in his old car, he said that on the day of the crime he saw an unknown young man. He arrived in a white car, which he left near the back porch of the house. William saw the suspicious man quickly disappear from the scene alone, and he thought that his cousin's trailer had been robbed. When he ran inside to make sure of this, he saw not the consequences of a robbery, but blood on the bedding. In his opinion, Rebecca was attacked and kidnapped, and then probably killed. Of course, the detectives could not believe it, because according to his confession, the criminal acted alone. Moreover, there was no reason to hide this information for 16 years. When he was exposed in a lie, William stated that he was ready to confess. According to him, on Monday morning he went hunting in the woods behind his grandfather's house. He knocked on the trailer where Rebecca was and asked to use the phone. Suspecting nothing, the girl let him in. However, this was a trick because he wanted to hunt for more interesting prey Rebecca. He was very nervous, so he accidentally touched the piano, and its leg broke off and fell. Then he grabbed the girl and beat her half to death, and then strangled her with golf clubs to make sure she was dead. After the massacre, he packed the body in a suitcase. He cleaned up the crime scene, collected the bloody bedding, sent some of it to the laundry. He turned the mattress over, took the body out in his pickup truck and threw it into a ravine. Moreover, on the way, he drove past the police station, not even afraid that he might be noticed or accidentally stopped. On the way back, he got rid of the piano leg and suitcase, indicating the place. The criminal just continued to live as if nothing had happened. He returned home in such a way that his mother did not even notice her son's absence while packing things. Then they made the move as planned. The motives for the brutal murder of Rebecca remained a mystery. William categorically denied any intentions to abuse the girl. Valuables were also not stolen from the crime scene. The suspect claimed that it was a spontaneous attack of aggression that got out of control. According to him, Rebecca did not provoke or offend him in any way, so there were no obvious reasons for the attack. William just wanted to shed someone else's blood. For a long time, the police were puzzled by one question. Why did William, having arrived in the Philippines and learning from his mother about the officer's call, not run away, but agreed to meet with the detectives? The man admitted that for many years he had been lying to everyone about this incident in order to make sure of his inviolability. He was absolutely sure that his involvement in the crime could not be proven. Therefore, without any hesitation, William appeared at the police station, hoping to finally remove all suspicions from himself and live carefree on. When the suspect was finally exposed, the investigators decided to use another cunning trick. The criminal acted too confidently, methodically, and accurately. There was a suspicion that William might have other crimes behind him. The detectives hinted to him that they were aware of his involvement in a number of other murders. Surprisingly, this tactic worked. As it turned out, this seemingly ordinary family man and father was a real serial killer. According to William himself, he took the life of his first victim at the age of 20. Since then, the man had constantly stalked pretty blonde girls, whom he brutally beat and strangled to death. Police officers unfolded a map of the area in front of the suspect. William, without hesitation, marked several points on it where, according to him, the bodies of the dead girls could be found. In total, he indicated 6 burial sites of the victims. 4 of them, according to the killer, were girls of easy virtue, and 2 were random passers-by whom he chose for no apparent reason. Later, William let slip that in addition to these victims, there could be 5 more girls whose disappearances occurred under similar circumstances. According to the suspect, he never robbed his victims. He chose girls who provided intimate services only because they were easy to lure into a trap, and hardly anyone would look for them after they disappeared. He admitted that he felt incredible excitement at the moment when the victims undressed, and then suddenly attacked from behind and strangled them with their own clothes. At this point, William's revelations about the fate of other victims stopped. He no longer wanted to talk to the investigators. The court took into account all the evidence, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to release.